helping out Ukraine, who's one of their neighbors. Is that what you read in the transcript?
I've heard that, yes.
So the whole idea that the president starting out with he doesn't like foreign aid, he doesn't think countries pay their fair share, that's looking out for the taxpayer. But there's more, and we talked about this in your deposition. We talked about it, about how clearly the challenges and concerns the president had with the involvement of high-level Ukrainian government officials, including the ambassador here in the United States that attacked him during his presidential campaign. The concerns of leaks that were leaks or just made-up stories and conspiracy theories that were spun in the Steele dossier that the Democrats on this committee own. They paid for it. Other DNC operatives that were working with the Ukrainian ambassador here in Washington, D.C. to dirty up your boss, the President of the United States. We're not going to hear from those witnesses. Just like we're not going to hear from the person we deposed on Saturday. We're not going to hear about what the real reason, the person who's in charge of making sure that foreign aid is delivered, we're not going to hear about what actually happened with the foreign aid. Wouldn't that have made it a lot easier for you to testify instead of guessing and doing little funny math problems up here? 2 + 2 = 4. It's great for all the viewers to hear that. Wouldn't it be easier if you just knew exactly why the foreign aid wasn't given?
It would have been easier to testify if I had a totality of the record.
And would you trust the person who's in charge of cutting the checks for foreign aid, the top career diplomat or the top career official?
I'd have no reason not to.
Thank you. Well, Ambassador, I don't know if we'll get to speak again if we have some more magical minutes, but I'm done with the questions with you. I know the rest of our members have more questions. And let me turn to, I know Mr. Castor has some more questions.
Hello again, Ambassador.
Hi.
We'll try not to use all of this time as a courtesy to you. Just want to go through some distinctions between your opener and your deposition and some other witnesses. In your opening statement today, you said President Trump directed us to talk with Rudy, correct?
Correct.
But then you and I had a little bit of a back and forth about the president just said, talk to Rudy. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, you took that to mean if we wanted to move forward with these types of things, Rudy was the place to go?
Rudy was the guy.
Okay. But President Trump didn't direct you to talk to Rudy, correct?
It wasn't an order. It was, if you want to work on this, this is the guy you got to talk to.
Ambassador Volker in his deposition said, I didn't take it as an instruction, but just as a comment. Talk to Rudy. You know, he knows these things. And you've got some bad people around him. I mean, that referring to the Ukrainian. So, I mean, Ambassador Volker hasn't testified that there's any sort of order or direction to talk to Rudy.
I don't know what he testified. It became very clear to all three of us that if we wanted to move the relationship forward, President Trump was not really interested in engaging. He wanted Rudy to handle it. And as I said in my opening statement, Secretary Perry took the lead and made the initial contact with Rudy, and that's when we began working with him.
And as to the question of whether Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires specifically of the President of the United States, in your deposition, you said, I don't know. I don't know if this was coming out of Rudy Giuliani irrespective of the President. Correct?
Yeah, I'm not going to dispute what I said in my deposition.
Okay.
That's true, yeah.
And we walked through all your communications with Rudy Giuliani, and they're not a lot, right?
Correct.
Ambassador Volker in his deposition on the same question said, I did not have that impression. I believe Mr. Giuliani was doing his own communications. And, you know, granted, Mr. Giuliani had business interests in Ukraine, correct?
Now I understand he did. Okay. I didn't know that at the time.
With Messrs. Parnas and Fruman, correct?
A lot of new names I've learned.
Okay. And you had never met with those folks?
No.
Okay. And then in your September 9th communication with the president, during your deposition, that was a striking moment when you walked us through your telephone call with President Trump on September 9th.
And by the way, I still cannot find a record of that call because the State Department and the White House cannot locate it, but I'm pretty sure I had the call on that day.
But whether it was the 9th or the 8th, you had this call. It was extremely memorable, right?
It was.
And you've been very honest, and we're not trying to give you a hard time on all the times you don't recall. We're just trying to say that there's a lot of important events that have happened that the committee's asked you about, and you've honestly said, I don't recall. But the call with President Trump on September 9th or the 8th, you recall it vividly, right?
I recall it vividly because it was keyed by the sort of frantic emails from Ambassador Taylor. I had, again, prior to that call, had all kinds of theories as to why things weren't moving, why there was no White House meeting, why there was no aid, why there was no this, why there was no that. And I was getting tired of going around in circles, frankly. So I made the call, and I asked, as I said, the open-ended question, what do you want from Ukraine? And that's when I got the answer.
He was unequivocal, nothing.
What I said in the text is what I heard.
And I'm curious, was that vignette in your opener today?
I don't think so.
How come? It's so memorable, so striking.
I don't know. It was in my previous testimony, and I assumed if people had questions, they would bring it up.
Okay. I mean, this is an example, you know, a lot of witnesses during the course of this investigation have dealt with ambiguities in different ways, and some have resolved them in the light least favorable to the president over and over again. This is an exculpatory fact shedding some light on the president's state of mind about the situation about the, you know.
And I'm happy to discuss it.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering why you didn't mention it in your opener.
There were so many things I wanted to include in my opening, and my opening was already, I think, 45 minutes or something. It would have been an hour and a half. There are a lot of things I'd like to have mentioned.
Okay, but you only had a couple conversations with the president, and we're trying to evaluate whether
it was not purposeful. Trust me.
Talking about striking conversations, Mr. Holmes, when he came here last Friday in the basement, I'll tell you, he thought your conversation that you had with the president was like the most memorable thing he's ever experienced.
How many conversations has he had with the president?
He probably hasn't had any. But he was energized, enthusiastic about telling us about this conversation. And
so not only did I buy him lunch, but I also provided entertainment?
Yeah, and he conferred with us that he regaled anyone that he came across with this story. And that's, I guess, a great discussion for Thursday. But other than the colorful language, and he was definitely moved by the color, but he was unequivocal that you brought up the Bidens in the post-call discussion. And he said something to the effect of the president's only interested in big things, and Mr. Holmes said that, oh, there's a lot of big things going on in the Ukraine, like there are. There's a war. Ukraine's under attack from the east by Russia. And he puts words in your mouth to the effect of, no, the president only cares about investigations like Rudy is pitching about the Bidens. And what's important about this is the day after the 725 call. And what's reported by Mr. Holmes, and you, to the extent you've confirmed it, isn't anything different than happened on the 725 call. Agreed? From the president's standpoint?
With 2020 hindsight, now that we've had the transcript of the call, the Bidens were clearly mentioned on the call, but I wasn't making the connection with the Bidens.
Right, but with regard to the president, it was just mentioning investigations.
That's all he said on the phone was investigations, I think.
But you told us time and again that you never realized the Bidens were part of any of this, the Burisma, and you talked about a continuum, and you never came to understand that until maybe as late as September 25th, correct?
I don't know the exact date, but it was pretty late.
Okay. And Ambassador Volker said the Bidens never came up after his one breakfast meeting with Mayor Giuliani, where he testified that he tried to disabuse the mayor of anything relating to the Bidens.
And I think Secretary Perry publicly stated that he never heard Biden either until the end.
So when you testify here today that you have no recollection of mentioning the Bidens to Mr. Holmes, that's not just a recollection, that's based on your state of mind at that point in time and your state of mind up to September 25th, correct?
I wasn't into investigating the Bidens.
So it's very surprising to you that he would mention that, right?
It was very surprising to me.
I want to go back to a couple things in your statement. This July 26th meeting with President Zelensky, earlier in the day from this lunch time event we've been talking about. During the course of the meeting with President Zelensky, did any of the parties discuss what came up on the telephone call?
I don't believe so.
Okay. So President Zelensky didn't express any concerns about the content of the call, right?
I mean, all I heard about that call was that it was a good call. It was friendly. Everyone was happy. I was delighted to hear that so that we could now move to the next phase, which was the meeting.
Okay. So you can tell us with certainty that nobody talked about demands in that meeting or fulfilling the president's demands?
I don't remember exactly. Again, this is a great example, Mr. Castro, of where I would have loved to have seen the notes from the meeting. I didn't take any notes, but I know there were notes taken. But I don't remember any heated conversation in the meeting. I remember it being a really, really friendly, good meeting. And that's why I said what I did to the president the next day, which was, Zelensky will do whatever you want. He's very happy.
And you don't remember any discussion by President Zelensky of lamenting how he had to navigate this difficult situation, right?
I don't know. I know that was in the whistleblower complaint, something about navigating something. I didn't remember anything like that.
I want to get back to your...
Gentlemen, yield a second.
Of course.
Which would be another helpful thing also, Ambassador, is if we actually had heard from the whistleblower and we had testimony of the whistleblower. Then you wouldn't have to be up here speculating as much and guessing, because you would have a source that would have been interviewed. We have his complaint. We could have matched it up with your testimony along with the people from OMB that would have made it very easy for you to testify, so you wouldn't have to just try to remember all this stuff and chase conspiracy theories around that the Democrats have continued to lay out for the last 6 weeks, moving from quid pro quo to extortion to bribery to where we at today, obstruction of justice, and now back to quid pro quo. We wouldn't have had to do all that if the whistleblower would have testified. You wouldn't have to speculate about what the whistleblower only had in his or her complaint that nobody seems to know. Back to Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. I want to turn to a couple of times in your opener, you said everyone was in the loop. And I just want to, these televised proceedings, sometimes we lose track of things, and everyone was not in the loop with your speculation or your guess that in the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur without public statement from the Ukraine. Everyone wasn't in the loop with that, right?
Well, the secretary was, because that's why I sent my email.
But your emails, let's look at your emails. There's 2 emails that you sent to the secretary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Better here?
August 22nd?
Right, and August 11th?
August 11th.
So the August 11th email, we went through this before. I'm sorry to go through it again. You said to the secretary, Kurt and I negotiated a statement from Z to be delivered for our review in a day or two. The contents will hopefully make the boss happy enough to authorize an invitation. Z plans to have a big presser on the openness subject next week. A couple things here. This is only relating to the White House meeting, correct?
Yes, I believe
Okay.
so.
And this is only, this is just investigations generally, making a public statement of openness generally, right?
Well, I think by August 11th, Mr. Castor, I think we were talking about 2016 in Burisma. The investigations generally was really early in the.
Okay, but do we know that Secretary Pompeo knows that?
I think so. I think.
Why?
Well, only because I think Counselor Breckbull was briefed
Okay.
on all of these things, and
By who? By you?
by I believe Ambassador Volker, by myself, various.
That's not what he testified to. I mean, did you?
Ambassador or Counselor Breckbull testified? I didn't know he had testified.
No, Ambassador Volker.
Oh, okay.
He didn't testify that he briefed Mr. Breckbull. I mean, this email to the secretary is talking about this statement, which, by the way, I mean, you said Kurt and I negotiated a statement, and the statement never went.
Didn't go anywhere.
Ambassador Volker said it wasn't a good idea. Mr. Yarmark said it wasn't a good idea. But what you're writing to the secretary here is just it relates to a generic openness subject, right?
Yeah, but I think the secretary, though, was on the July 25th call, which obviously I wasn't on and I didn't know about.
Okay, but you used this email to suggest that everyone was in the loop, that like security sector assistance was tied to some sort of act by the Ukrainians.
No, I don't think I said that. I don't think I said that this assistance was involved here.
Okay.
I think
so
was.
What was everyone in the loop about then?
Well, the secretary was in the loop that we had negotiated a statement.
Okay.
I'm fairly comfortable that the secretary knows that where the statement was at that point. In other words, the 2016 in Burisma, and that Lisa passed that along to him and kept him informed.
Okay, so we can agree that at this point in time, the secretary wasn't in a loop, that there was a conditionality on the security sector assistance.
Hold on a second. Are you asking about July 19th, Exhibit 4?
I was asking about your email to the secretary on August 11th.
Oh, okay.
There's,
Well, on July 19th, which the secretary was on, I talked about fully transparent investigation and turn over every stone, and the secretary was on that.
okay.
So,
But you testified at your deposition that on July 19th, in this continuum you talked about,
yeah.
at that point in the continuum, it was just a generic investigation. Wasn't anything involving.
I think it went, again, I'm not trying to put words in anywhere. I think it went from the original generic from, May 23rd when we left the Oval Office. We're talking about corruption and oligarchs until Mr. Giuliani started to become involved, and then it transitioned into the Burisma.
You hadn't even talked to Giuliani by that time. This is July 19th.
Mr. Castro, with all respect, will you allow him to finish his answer, please?
Sorry, use the mic.
Will you allow him to finish his answer?
Of course, I apologize.
We were communicating with Mr. Giuliani through Secretary Perry and through Ambassador Volker. Okay. I wasn't talking to Mr. Giuliani directly until after August 1st.
But as of July 19th, weren't we still on the generic part of the continuum?
I don't know. I believe by then we were talking about Burisma in 2016, to be candid.
But not Biden.
No, not Biden.
Okay.
No.
And then turning to your email of August 11th.
Yeah, got it.
I'm sorry, we just dealt with that. August the 22nd.
22nd?
Yeah, it's page 23 of your opener.
Yeah, I got it.
And this is where you were requesting a pull aside for the president. And this is when the president was.
He was still going to go.
He was going to go. It was before the hurricane.
Right.
Bumped that off his schedule. I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place, Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to the president and the United States. Hopefully that'll break the logjam. And at this point in time, the issues of importance to the president of the United States were what?
The 2 investigations.
Okay. But nothing to do with Vice President Biden, right?
Again, I didn't make the connection.
I want to just pivot briefly to the president's concerns about foreign assistance. Under Secretary Hale, who will be with us later today, testified that during this relevant time frame, there was a real focus to re-examine all federal aid programs. Are you aware of that interest of the president?
I'm generally aware of the president's skepticism toward foreign aid and, conditioning foreign aid on certain things. I'm generally aware of that, yes.
And Ambassador Hale testified, and his testimony's been public, almost a zero-based concept that each assistance program and each country that receives the program be evaluated. The program made sense, that we avoid nation building, and that we not provide assistance to countries that are lost to us in terms of policy, whether it's because corruption or another reason. Is that something you were aware of at the time?
Generally, yes.
Okay. And you're certainly aware that the president was concerned about the European allies' contributions to the region?
Exactly why I was involved.
Okay. So, as we get down to September 11th, right before you're advocating that the pause be lifted, correct?
Yeah, I personally didn't think the pause should have ever been put in place.
Okay.
Yeah.
But as we get down to September 11th and you're talking with Senator Johnson and so forth, you don't know with certainty that the genuine reason the president was implementing the pause wasn't because of his concerns about the allies or his concerns about foreign assistance generally, or that he wasn't just trying to hold the aid as long as he could to see what he could, what type of information he could get about those 2 subjects.
Fair enough.
Okay. I am really trying to finish up before so I can yield some time back. Do we have anything else, Mr.
I have nothing else.
Thank you. Yield back.
Chairman yields back.
Back the balance of our time.
Let's take a 30-minute recess to allow Ambassador Sondland get a bite to eat. I think the members of the committee might like to get a bite to eat. And then we will resume with the member rounds of questioning of 5 minutes. If we could allow the witnesses to have the opportunity to leave the room first.
Mr. Chairman, Ambassador Sondland had intended to fly back to Brussels to resume his duties at the end of the day, and so it would be a great convenience to us if we could have a shorter break now and resume with the members' questions and try and wrap up in time that he might be able to make his flight.
I appreciate that, Counsel. We all have a busy schedule these days. The member round of questions should take, I think, slightly less than 2 hours, so I think you should be good, depending on the time of your flight. But we will endeavor to make the break as short as possible. If you'd like to excuse yourself from the room before the rest of the crowd.
About 4 hours into the testimony of Ambassador Gordon Sondland, the committee now going to take about a half-hour lunch break. You just heard that exchange between Ambassador Sondland's attorney and Chairman Schiff. the ambassador wants to get back to work in Brussels as ambassador to the European Union. What we've just seen is a little over an hour of questioning from the committee chairman, the ranking Republican on the committee, and of their two counsels. Republicans honing in on Ambassador Sondland's testimony that he never received a direct request from President Trump to tie the military aid or the White House meeting to the investigations requested from Ukraine. Democrats focusing on Sondland's testimony that over the course of his meetings and phone calls with President Trump and President Trump's direction to speak with his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, that the ambassador did in fact believe there was a direct quid pro quo between a White House meeting and investigations of Ukraine, and he came to conclude that the military aid was tied to investigations as well. A lot of this testimony focused on an early September phone call between the president and Ambassador Sondland, and as Ambassador Sondland was testifying, the president was about to get on a plane to Texas today, and he decided to come to the cameras and basically reenact that phone call. Let's look.
I'm going to go very quickly, just a quick comment on what's going on in terms of testimony with Ambassador Sondland. And I just noticed one thing, and I would say that means it's all over. What do you want from Ukraine? He asks me, screaming, what do you want from Ukraine? I keep hearing all these different ideas and theories. This is Ambassador Sondland speaking to me. Just happened. To which I turned off the television. What do you want from Ukraine? I keep hearing all these different ideas and theories. What do you want? What do you want? It was a very short and abrupt conversation that he had with me. They said he was not in a good mood. I'm always in a good mood. I don't know what that is. He just said, now he's talking about what my response. So he's going, what do you want? What do you want? I hear all these theories. What do you want, right? And now, here's my response that he gave, just gave. Ready? You have the cameras rolling? I want nothing. That's what I want from Ukraine. That's what I said. I want nothing. I said it twice. So he goes, he asked me the question, what do you want? I keep hearing all these things. What do you want? He finally gets me. I don't know him very well. I have not spoken to him much. This is not a man I know well. Seems like a nice guy, though. But I don't know him well. He was with other candidates. He actually supported other candidates. Not me. Came in late. But here's my response. Now, if you weren't fake news, you'd cover it properly. I say to the ambassador in response, I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky, President Zelensky, to do the right thing. So here's my answer. I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing. Then he says, this is the final word from the President of the United States. I want nothing. Thank you, folks. Have a good time. I'm going to bed.
Saw the president reading from some notes there. We have a picture of the president's handwritten notes, what he was reading from as he decided to come out and face the cameras. John Carl, I want to bring you back in here. It seems pretty clear what the president and the Republican strategy is going to be here to focus on that phone call, on the testimony from Ambassador Sondland that he didn't receive any direct request from the president to condition that aid, but the president had kind of a selective reading of his phone call and encounters with Ambassador Sondland there.
He sure did. Ambassador Sondland, as we've discussed, made it perfectly clear that there was a quid pro quo in terms of having a meeting at the White House with President Zelensky, that to do that, it was Ambassador Sondland's understanding there would have to be an announcement of an investigation into those, into the firm involving Hunter Biden and into the 2016 issue involving the Democrats, and that he came to believe, based on what he was hearing from Rudy Giuliani and others, that there was also a conditionality on the military aid, that the military aid would not go until that investigation was announced. So he's selectively reading from that one text message. The other thing that you get a sense from the White House and their response is that, Ambassador Sondland has made it clear that he never directly heard from the president a direct order about that quid pro quo, that this was, through Rudy Giuliani, through other channels. It became to be his understanding. So part of the White House defense here seems to be that even if there was a quid pro quo on these issues, it was not one directly ordered by the president.
That is what they've been talking about. Terry Moran in Washington. Now so much focus, of course, going to be on Rudy Giuliani and several others that Ambassador Sondland has mentioned in his testimony today. We even had Rudy Giuliani, over the course of his testimony, send out a tweet that suggested he didn't know Sondland that well, didn't talk to him that often, now been taken down because that had contradicted his previous testimony. We've heard Republicans in the past talk about the fact that at some point the president might have to cut Rudy Giuliani loose.
It looks like Rudy Giuliani is now the last line of defense for President Trump. As we just heard, President Trump quoting Gordon Sondland from that telephone call. He said, "I want nothing, have Zelensky do the right thing." If there was a quid pro quo, which Sondland acknowledges there was, then Rudy Giuliani's the point person. He's the middleman, next middleman up, as it were. But there is a cost here to Republicans in this line of defense. Look, in a lot of criminal trials where the evidence stacks up on one side, the defense might select one item of evidence from the other side. The gloves didn't fit. And so they acquitted. In this instance, here is a phone call in which the president himself says, "I don't want any kind of quid pro quo, no quid pro quo." But there may be, the Democrats argue, much more evidence on the other side.
That's the Democratic argument. Barbara Comstock. We saw Republicans going in and out of the hearing room. At some point, there were only a couple at the stand. They seemed to perhaps be trying to come up and coordinate a strategy. And it did seem by the end of this 2 hours that they were zeroing in on that idea that there was no direct request from the president.
Yes, well, that's the focus for today. But I think the problem they have is Mick Mulvaney was still given an order, presumably from the president, to stop the aid. And that whole line of questioning to him and to other OMB aides, how did that come out to happen? And then you also have certainly Rudy. What discussions did the president have with Rudy and others? And John Bolton again, John Bolton was originally the one who said, he didn't want to have anything to do with this drug deal. So presumably there were some conversations, probably some very heated conversations between and among some more senior people regarding this. So I think the problem Republicans have in looking at this is the shifting sands here and where do you stand?
And figuring out where to stand. Meantime, one thing, David Muir, that Ambassador Sondland did not back away from under questioning from either side is the fact that he was not doing this alone in any way. Mulvaney was involved, Pompeo was involved, Secretary Perry was involved. Everybody was in on it.
And he said this from the very beginning today, George, in his opening statement. He said that he engaged with the Secretary of State a number of times, saying, please share this with S, which we all know as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And he continued to answer this afternoon, saying it was his belief that everyone knew in the end, by the time you got to early September, what the deliverables meant. Mr. Goldman went back at him after this effort to say, did the president ever directly tell you? And he said no to Stephen Castor, the Republican attorney. Goldman going back to him about the deliverables, and that's where he said, I believe that those deliverables were investigations into both Burisma and saying so publicly in order to get the military aid in that White House meeting. One other thing, though, that the Democrats have pushed here, too, is this notion, and they did this yesterday with Ambassador Volker, is how on earth did they not know, in the Democrats' words, in so many words, that Burisma did not mean Biden. And in the questioning for today, he said Ambassador Volker yesterday testified to a similar epiphany was the word that was used today, for lack of a better word, that in hindsight, had you known then what we know now about Burisma, would you have objected? Is that your belief? And Sondland said today, that is my belief.
Yeah, we actually have that. Let's show that. He made that exact same, said he would have raised objections had he reached that conclusion earlier.
Let me ask you this. Ambassador Volker testified yesterday to a similar epiphany, for lack of a better word. This is what he said. In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them very different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect, I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections. Does that sum up your views as well?
It does.
Cecilia, it is a little hard to believe that anyone who is dealing with this day-to-day, the Ukraine, by May, June, July, August did not know that investigation of the Burismas included the Bidens. You had the president going on Fox News talking about it. You had Rudy Giuliani talking about it, front page stories in the New York Times.
I would say it's not just a little hard to believe, it's actually impossible to believe, and it's probably just not true. Not just you had Giuliani on Fox, you had the president had tweeted about it. This was in the New York Times. If you've got a high-ranking official, an ambassador, one of the most prominent ambassadors in Washington, saying he doesn't know that Burisma equals the Bidens is just preposterous.
Dan Abrams, but it does seem like the president's defenders are banking a lot on this distinction.
Absolutely, but they're also banking on the distinction between I was told and I presumed and speculation and guess. And this is, I think, the most important cleanup that the Democrats still need to do, which is Steve Castor was very effective, I think, the Republican counsel, in putting words into the mouth of Gordon Sondland and saying, well, that's your speculation, your guess, right, and sort of saying it as if, of course, he'd said this is just a speculation and just a guess. He then says, Sondland says, I presumed. They need to really elicit out of Sondland how he came to this conclusion. Because according to Sondland, this wasn't just a guess. It wasn't just speculation. He knew it. He knew this to be the case.
And he does seem to go back and forth because several times on his own he's referred back to the 2 + 2 = 4 logical conclusion when questioned by the Democrats, but then he goes back to presuming when questioned by the Republicans.
He's accepting the words from Castor, right? He's trying not to be confrontational here. And I think he's actually been a very good witness from a sort of witness perspective. He listens to the questions very carefully. He's not even, there are times when someone doesn't ask a question.
I thought he actually had one remarkable moment. He said he conceded as he looked at his lawyer, I'm trying not to get into trouble here.
Yeah, right. No, and I think that's exactly what he's trying to do. So when Castor says, your speculation, your guess, he's not saying it's not my speculation, it's not my guess. He's going to wait for additional questions. And I think the Democrats still have to really elicit that out of him. They need for him to say, all right, lay out for us. You were certain, right? 2 + 2 = 4. You were certain that this was conditioned on the aid, not the White House visit. The aid was conditioned on these investigations. Take us through. You talked to Rudy Giuliani. Then what happened? What else made you get through this whole thing so that it's clearer, I think, to the public exactly where Sondland is coming from on this absolutely critical issue.
Martha Raddatz, as he's been testifying, Secretary Pompeo, I believe he's overseas now, had his first press conference where he got questioned about this.
He is in Brussels right now, and he was asked numerous times today and did not respond to questions, but finally he did. He was asked, Ambassador Sondland testified today in Washington that there was a clear quid pro quo over Ukraine and that everyone was in the loop. That was obviously in the testimony, including you. Is that true? And do you think you should consider recusing yourself from decisions involving documents provided Congress on Ukraine? He said, I didn't see the testimony. I'm not going to recuse myself from this. I know precisely what American policy was with respect to Ukraine. I was working on it, and I'm incredibly proud of what we've accomplished. He goes on to make some more remarks about Ukraine and what that policy was, but just a reminder of what Gordon Sondland said. Throughout these events, we kept State Department leadership and others apprised of what we were doing. State Department was fully supportive of our engagement in Ukraine affairs and was aware that a commitment to investigations was among the issues we were pursuing.
Including direct emails with Secretary Pompeo. Mary Bruce, I want to go to you on that because on that exact point, there's actually a hearing up on Capitol Hill that is also going on this morning for the Deputy Secretary of State, Steve Biegun, his confirmation hearings, and he's getting pressed precisely on this point, whether or not Secretary Pompeo should be involved in the document production on an issue where he's clearly implicated.
Yeah, and George, one of the big questions coming out of this hearing this morning is just how pervasive all of this appeared to be. We heard Chairman Schiff coming out in one of the previous breaks and saying that the knowledge was pervasive. And of course, Democrats up here want to talk to a lot of these other key players. They want to talk to the former National Security Advisor John Bolton. They want to talk to the acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. But the president and the White House are blocking them from appearing. It only boosts the Democrats' argument, they feel, that the president has been obstructing obstructing this investigation. And it is raising a lot of questions about how Secretary of State Pompeo is going to conduct himself going forward, given his clear involvement in this campaign to pressure Ukraine. So while Republicans can argue that Gordon Sondland it was drawing his own conclusions here, it will be a question for Republicans. Why then are they not pushing the White House to allow them to speak to some of these other key players?
I want to bring that question to Dan Abrams. I was struck, and maybe they just don't care about the contradiction. They're willing to bull through it. But you've seen it, especially in the questioning by Devin Nunes. He keeps talking about, you're not letting us talk to the whistleblower. You're not letting us talk to, I think, the number 4 or 5 official at OMB who testified behind closed doors on Saturday, at the same time that they are holding back that man's boss.
Right. Well, I mean, look, that argument from Nunes makes no sense when you think about the big picture here, which is that the key people who need to testify to tell us whether Sondland is telling the truth or not are Pompeo, Bolton, and Perry. And the president. And Mulvaney and the president. But
and Giuliani.
I'm trying to at least be realistic here, right? I'm creating a wish list that isn't like absurd.
He did
right?
call them key witnesses.
Yeah, right. So you know, and the administration is not letting any of them testify. Not only that, but again, they're not handing over the documents that Sondland himself is saying would help refresh my memory. I need my own documents. I need to be able to look back at this stuff. So to sit there and say, well, you know, another witness was refreshing your memory, well, there's a very easy way to solve this. Let him have access to the documents that he helped create, that he was involved in, that will help him refresh his memory.
Meantime, Cecilia Vega, he sent out so many flares in so many directions this morning. We are getting a response from the vice president's office.
Yeah, a little bit of a tit for tat, if you will, because there are 2 different versions right now of reality, frankly. Sondland, you'll remember this morning, had testified that he says he spoke to Vice President Biden before the meetings with the Ukrainians, and that he told him that he had concerns with the delay in aid that had become tied to this issue of the investigations. The vice president's office is pushing back strongly on this, saying that the discussion recalled by Ambassador Sondland never happened. We're hearing from folks in the White House. Our White House reporter, Jordan Phelps, says that she's got senior administration official telling her that they're denying that there was ever any sort of substantive interaction, verbal or even nonverbal, between Vice President Pence and Sondland. So some strong denial on that front.
Even though there was a conversation. Pierre Thomas, we're hearing an awful lot about Rudy Giuliani today, as I was just discussing with Terry Moran. And remind everyone, 2 of his associates, Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, have actually been indicted by the Southern District of New York. And there's little question now that the Southern District is at least looking at Rudy Giuliani.
That's their end, George. Clearly, these 2 men who were working with Rudy Giuliani, they were involved in an effort to get Marie Yovanovitch, the former ambassador to the Ukraine, removed out of that job. They were successful, according to a number of sources that we have. The Southern District is looking at that. That gives them the end. But, George, here's the thing that strikes me most about the testimony we've seen today. Sondland is making clear that he went directly to the Ukrainian officials and made clear to them, you need to do these investigations or announce these investigations involving the DNC server and also Burisma, which also in turn meant the Bidens, and that he did so. Why? Because of Rudy Giuliani, and that he spoke for the president. And that is the thing that is so dominant here, that the outsized role that Rudy Giuliani was playing in all of this, that you had to speak to Rudy Giuliani to know what the president wanted, and that he was acting at the direction of the president. That's the key issue.
And I want to pick up on that because it's a question I've had. And John Carl, let me bring you in on this because Gordon Sondland talked about a chicken and egg issue earlier, and I wonder if there's another one. Does this start with the president saying, Rudy Giuliani, I want you to go investigate this, or does it start with Rudy Giuliani coming to the president, pushing him and saying, I've got this evidence, this CrowdStrike thing is real. We know that, for example, that an envelope that he had brought to the White House was then sent over to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It does seem at some level there is evidence that it was Rudy Giuliani who was driving this.
There's some evidence of this, George, but think about how enticing this was to the president. The idea that Ukraine was the entity that interfered in the 2016 elections, not Russia. The idea that it was Ukraine, that they were doing it not to help him, but to help Hillary Clinton. You wouldn't have taken very much to get President Trump pushing for this idea that we want to investigate the Ukrainians and whether or not they were the ones that were actually the bad actors in 2016. It moves the pressure off of the Russians. It moves aside any question of whether or not the Russians helped him. There was another foreign government that was trying to help Hillary Clinton. This is a conspiracy theory, George, that has been thoroughly debunked, but you can see how it would be appealing to the president. Add in the second factor, an announcement of an investigation that would tarnish Joe Biden, his potential rival in the 2020 election. So did this start with Rudy Giuliani? I don't know, but you can see why it was attractive to the president. But a point I wanted to make is that you now have Bill Taylor, who was the top official at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, and Gordon Sondland, who is the ambassador to the European Union, and it appears to be the State Department's main point person in dealing with Ukraine. Both of them wanting to see a meeting between the president and the president of Ukraine to go forward. Both of them frustrated by the idea that military aid had been withheld, and both of them fully operating under the understanding that the president was demanding a quid pro quo, that the president was demanding that these investigations be announced before either of those things happened. It's hard to see how it's anything. You know, it's hard to see how the Republicans can deny that or say, as the president just did, that he didn't want anything. Well, if he didn't want anything, where did these demands come from?
And Sondland, you're exactly right. And Sondland, David, you're built on that today with that exchange with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, where he wanted clearance to set up that meeting between the president and President Zelensky, a pull-aside where they could finally clear this thing up, clear the logjam.
Absolutely. And he said by clearing the logjam, he knew that everyone within this circle, which is the point he continued to make this morning, was fully aware of what that logjam meant. It meant going public with the investigations both into Burisma and the 2016 election, Burisma obviously meaning the Bidens. One of the things, though, on the point that you made with Terry earlier about Rudy Giuliani perhaps being this last line of defense for the president, is you could almost see the Republicans in the second round of questioning this afternoon make that turn. If they think they have a hole, that opening with Ambassador Sondland acknowledging that the president never directly said to him, and if they think that the president's defense on the lawn there at the White House about saying no quid pro quo, that perhaps now it all rests on Rudy Giuliani. And you heard Steve Castor, obviously the lawyer for the Republicans there, asking, you testified Mr. Giuliani's request for a quid pro quo for the White House meeting indicated that you believe that he was advancing President Trump's interests, correct? And he said, my contact with Giuliani began late in the process after August 1st. But then he presses, but you testified that Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the president, correct? That's our understanding, yes, was Sondland's answer. And then he said, well, how did you know that? Who told you? He did have an answer to that. He said, when the president says, talk to my personal attorney, talk to Rudy, that's what we assume he meant. And going back to the opening statement, George, he said, Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the president of the United States, and we knew that these investigations were important to the president. So breaking down that barrier about whether or not this was from Rudy Giuliani or whether or not Rudy Giuliani did represent the interests of the president.
And one of the things they try to do is draw a distinction between Ambassador Volker yesterday, who saw the request to go talk to Giuliani, as more of a request. Go talk to my lawyer, Giuliani, and not a demand that you must work through him. I do want to bring Terry Moran back in on that point, Terry, because we now do know that the Southern District is looking at Rudy Giuliani. As I said, it brings up an interesting question of timing, whether any action they take, if they're indeed going to take action, comes before these proceedings are over.
That's right. He needs lawyers in several jurisdictions right now, and it may be that the investigation in the Southern District of New York, however that ends up for Rudy Giuliani, will prevent him from providing what is right now the crucial testimony in this impeachment investigation. Gordon Sondland, several others have said it all came through Rudy Giuliani. To do a fair job of investigating what happened here, the Congress, the American people, needs to hear from Rudy Giuliani. It's probably not going to happen. But circumstantially, as you look at it overall, you can see that all of the officials that we've heard from or read about in this investigation have essentially acknowledged that something wrong was happening, a consciousness of the guilt of what was going down, the quid pro quo that Sondland says was in fact happening, if not directly from the orders of the president. And their testimony, the testimony of people like Pompeo and Mick Mulvaney and John Bolton, would bolster that case and perhaps get us closer to the president's own words. And it's worth noting, why is Gordon Sondland testifying today? He says he was directed by the White House and the State Department, like others, to refuse to testify. But here's what he said. I agreed to testify because I respect the gravity of the moment, and I believe I have an obligation to account for my role in these events. And that's a kind of public service that is rare right now in this moment in American history.
And you've actually seen it by all those who've come forward under the subpoena. And I wonder if you agree with the conclusion that many who've been watching today have reached, including Ken Starr, the special prosecutor who took on Bill Clinton back in 1998, saying that at this point it certainly does, and maybe we were there before this, impeachment, at least in the House, inevitable.
It certainly looks like it. Look, the Democrats have the votes, but the country, I think the polls indicate, are aware that something very wrong happened in this relationship with Ukraine, and impeachment is a way of trying that charge, of having an actual trial where that could be thrashed out to the point of the guilt of the president or not.
I think part of the reason that Gordon Sondland wanted to testify today was to defend himself. I mean, he's come across up to this point as kind of a buffoonish character who was leading this irregular channel outside of the normal course of business, and that he was the one leading this effort, in effect,
muscling his way into
on
it.
behalf of the president. I think he wanted to come in front of the Congress and the American people to say, hey, A, I'm a very smart guy who was very supportive of Ukraine, and all of this was well thought out, and B, it wasn't an irregular channel. In fact, everyone else was well aware of what I was doing.
Yeah, Martha, I want to bring into this. There was a question I brought up with David earlier. It does seem that if you were reading his deposition from a couple of weeks ago, somewhat crabbed, constrained, he was being extra careful, didn't look all that comfortable, at least to read it, didn't seem all that comfortable. Very different demeanor here. A guy who was not particularly nervous taking on questions from all sides.
He didn't seem nervous at all. And one of the principal things he did is, as Dan said, as we've all said, bring everybody else in with him, bring in Pompeo, make very clear that this wasn't some rogue channel, but this became U.S. foreign policy. It was not, as he said, it was impossible to call it an irregular channel if you have the president, Pompeo, Perry, Volker, all read in, adding there were no concerns remarked on. No one said back off at any point. And I think that's what Sondland appeared today, that he wanted to get out there, that he wasn't just off on his own. All these others were involved. You also had him complaining about the fairness of this because he didn't get those documents. He didn't get all those emails, although obviously he had some. And you heard Adam Schiff say at the very beginning, we can see why Secretary Pompeo and President Trump have made such a concerted and across-the-board effort to obstruct this investigation and this impeachment inquiry. And I will just say this, they do so at their own peril.
And George, just to underscore this point about how everybody was in the loop, that's the case he's trying to make today, and that this wasn't an irregular channel if you have all of these major players involved. I went back through the opening statements just to try to find how often he talked about the others that he was keeping informed. He said, we kept the leadership at the State Department and the NSC informed in our activities. That included communications with Secretary of State Pompeo. We kept the NSC apprised of our efforts, he went on to say, including specifically our efforts to secure this public statement from the Ukrainians. He went on to say everyone was in the loop. It was no secret. Everyone was informed via email. Again, everyone was in the loop, he said again later. State Department leadership expressed their total support for our efforts. And then again, he says, with the express support of Secretary Pompeo, I move forward.
Yeah. George, can I just say one little thing about the Burisma thing that we keep bringing up, too, and why they didn't know Biden was involved? What strikes me is why those two ambassadors wouldn't ask more questions about it. If they now think this is what they have to do to please the president, to please Rudy Giuliani, get this meeting, what did they think Burisma was? I mean, it's an old Ukrainian natural gas company that's been around since the early 2000s. There had been some corruption. Why in the world would they think the president wanted to focus on that?
I don't think we know. I think I can hazard a guess as to what that was. And they've been very clear. One of the things that Ambassador Sondland said is, listen, I didn't think this was the right policy. I didn't think this was the right thing to do. But I did believe that it was important for us to have a good relationship with Ukraine. So they basically, Dan Abrams, I don't know if you agree with this or not, he's basically turned a blind eye and said, let's just try to get this done in the least objectionable way possible and hope we can move beyond
Look, it's hard not to believe at all Volker, right, and Sondland on this. They both seem pretty credible when they're saying again and again, I didn't make the connection to Biden. It's hard to believe, but they do come across as pretty credible on that. Is it possible that they just thought this was a particular pet project of the president? Is it possible that they didn't want to know why he wanted to go after Burisma? That maybe it's better that they not ask questions on it?
They could also tell themselves, and this was a point that Ambassador Sondland pretty much hammered home today, they didn't even think that this was about getting investigations. It was about announcing investigations.
Right. Well, that's Sondland saying
Sondland,
that, right? Yeah, Sondland making clear it's about the announcement, which is one of the most devastating pieces of his testimony, right? Because the whole theory here is that the Republicans are laying out is he wanted to make sure that there be investigations into corruption, and there's nothing wrong with that. If it's just about making an announcement for the sake of a press conference, that is far less convincing an explanation than an actual investigation.
And John Carl, it's hard to dial back to what was happening back in May, but when you think about when this story first broke in May in the New York Times, Rudy Giuliani actually had to publicly say he wasn't going to go through with these trips because there was something of an outcry.
There absolutely wasn't. And George, during this period of time, I've asked official after official after official who supports what Giuliani is saying and doing on this, and the answer I got is basically one person. The
President of the United States. Thank you all. Let's go back to the hearing room.
Recognize myself for 5 minutes. First of all, I wanted to clarify something for the record. With respect to the witness who testified on Saturday, that is Mr. Sandy. He is a career official with the Office of Management and Budget. He is today reviewing his transcript, an opportunity we give all the witnesses before their transcript is released to make sure that it's accurate and correct. As his deposition was only taken on Saturday, this was the soonest we could arrange that. We did inform the minority yesterday that if they wish to use any of the questioning from Mr. Sandy's deposition, they could do so, and we would happily take whatever excerpts they needed even prior to the witness having the chance to go through it. They chose not to take advantage of that opportunity. But I would make this far more significant point, which is he is not the top official at the Office of Management and Budget responsible for releasing foreign assistance. Those individuals are named Vaught and Duffy. And both of those political appointees have been subpoenaed to testify, and both of those political appointees have refused. In fact, as the deposition will make clear when the transcript is released, at a certain point, Mr. Sandy was taken out of at least one significant part of the process. But that transcript will be made available as soon as he finishes the review, and we can redact any personal information from it. I want to ask you just a few questions, and our staff, because the expanded round had time to get through much of what I wanted to ask you, Ambassador. But with respect to the statement, you were going back, and I mean by you and others, Ambassador Volker and others, were going back and forth with the Ukrainians to figure out what statement they would have to make to get the meeting, correct?
Correct.
And they understood they were going to have to make this statement publicly in order to get the meeting?
Correct.
Similarly, you testified that pretty much everyone could put 2 and 2 together and make 4, and understood that the military assistance was also conditioned on the public announcement of these 2 investigations, correct?
That was my presumption, yeah.
You put 2 and 2 together and you got 4. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, you're capable of putting 2 and 2 together, and so are the Ukrainians. They could put 2 and 2 together as well. They understood there was a hold on security assistance. There's testimony that they understood that in July or August, but it was without a doubt understood when it was made public in the newspaper. They understood that the security assistance was being held up, right?
I don't know when they understood it, but presumably they did.
Well, certainly once it was public, they understood the security assistance was withheld, right?
Once it was public, I assume so, yes.
And indeed, that was one of the issues that was brought up in that meeting between Zelensky and Pence in Warsaw.
I think, as I testified previously, Chairman, I think Zelensky, if I recall, asked the question more open-ended, like, when do we get our money?
Well, okay. So they understood they didn't have the money yet. It had been approved by Congress. There was a hold on it. Yep. You couldn't give them any explanation.
I couldn't.
Is that right?
That's right.
They asked, you couldn't tell them why it was being withheld, right?
I could not.
And if they couldn't put 2 and 2 together, you put 2 and 2 together for them because you told them in Warsaw they were going to need to make that public statement, likely to get that aid released. Is that
I
right?
said I presume that might have to be done in order to get the aid released.
Because we've had a lot of argumentation here. Well, the Ukrainians didn't know the aid was withheld, but the Ukrainians found out, and then it was made abundantly clear, if they hadn't put 2 and 2 together themselves, that if they wanted that aid, they were going to have to make these statements, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Nunes.
Yield to Mr. Ratcliffe.
Ambassador Sondland, I'm going to try and quickly move to summarize all of your direct communications with President Trump as it relates to this inquiry, and of course you can correct me if I get it wrong. On May 23rd, you had a group meeting that included what you called a vanilla request about ending corruption involving Ukrainian oligarchs, correct?
Correct.
On July 25th, you called President Trump to say you were on your way to Ukraine, but nothing of substance occurred on that call, correct?
Correct.
On July 26th, you had a 5-minute call at a restaurant that you didn't originally remember because it, according to your statement this morning, quote, did not strike me as significant at the time, end quote, but once refreshed, recalled that the primary purpose was a rapper named A$AP Rocky, correct?
Correct.
And on September 9th, and most importantly, reading from your deposition, you called President Trump to ask him, what do you want from Ukraine? He responded, I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. I want Zelensky to do the right thing. I want him to do what he ran on. And what he ran on was fighting corruption, correct?
Correct.
And then lastly, on October 2nd, in a random in-person meeting that you had at an event for the Finnish president, you ran into President Trump and advised him that you'd been called to testify before Congress, and he said to you, good, go tell the truth.
That's correct.
All right. And that is the entirety of your recollection of your direct communications with President Trump about these matters.
I may have had another call or meeting or two. I wish, Mr. Ratcliffe, I had the record.
I understand, but this is what you recall.
This is what I recall.
Okay. So stop me if there's anything sinister or nefarious in any of this. A vanilla request about corruption, a call to say I'm on my way to Ukraine, a 5-minute call you didn't remember as significant, but the primary purpose was to discuss a rapper, a call that you made where the president said, I want nothing, I want no quid pro quo, I want Zelensky to do the right thing, I want him to do what he ran on, and him telling you to go tell Congress the truth. Anything sinister or nefarious about any of that?
Not the way you present it.
Okay, and that is the truth as you've presented it, correct?
Correct.
All right, why that's important, Ambassador Sondland, is because none of that is hearsay. None of that is speculation. None of that is opinion. That is direct evidence. And ultimately, that is what, if this proceeds to the Senate, they're going to care about. Unlike this proceeding, which has been based on largely speculation and presumption and opinion, this is direct testimony and direct evidence. And to that point, none of that included evidence about the Bidens, and none of that included evidence about military assistance, because President Trump never mentioned either of those to you, correct?
That's correct.
All right. So going back to the July 26th call, because it's going to be a spectacle tomorrow, you didn't remember it because it didn't strike you as significant at the time. Is it fair to say that if the President of the United States was asking you to do or say something improper or unlawful, that would have been significant to you?
Yes.
All right. And if that call was part of a bribery or extortion scheme that you were part of, as Democrats have alleged, you'd remember that as significant, wouldn't you?
I was not a part, and I would have remembered.
I understand that, and I agree with you. Let's turn to the quid pro quo, because it's been reported in the papers that this was blockbuster testimony today about quid pro quo and new evidence. To be fair to you, Ambassador Sondland, according to your statement today, as you say on page 14, as you testified previously, this was your opinion that there was a quid pro quo, correct?
The 2016 Burisma and the 2016 election and Burisma in return for the White House meeting. That's
right.
Correct.
So you've shared that before. To that point, to be clear again, on the part of it that relates to military assistance, though, you don't have any direct evidence from President Trump about that part of it. That's your 2 + 2 part of the equation, right? The presumption, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And you understand also that others disagreed. Yesterday we heard from Mr. Morrison, Ambassador Volker. They testified that they didn't see a quid pro quo. Do you understand that?
I understand that. That's what they said.
That reasonable people could look at all of this and come to different conclusions. Correct?
Correct.
I yield back.
Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you for testifying. Ambassador, a couple things jumped out at me in your testimony. In your opening statement, you say Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing investigations of the 2016 election DNC server in Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew that these investigations were important to the President. That last sentence is interesting. No conditionality, no modifiers. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States. Mr. Giuliani communicates in colorful and memorable terms. What did Mr. Giuliani say to you that caused you to say that he is expressing the desires of the President of the United States?
Mr. Himes, when that was originally communicated, that was before I was in touch with Mr. Giuliani directly. So this all came through Mr. Volker and others.
So Mr. Volker told you that he was expressing the desires of the President of the United States?
Correct.
And subsequently, when you saw the transcript of the July 25th conversation with President Zelensky, you put it all together, and yeah, this is the desire of the President of the United States.
After I saw the July 25th reading.
Right. Okay. Other thing that is interesting here, the theme of your testimony today is that everybody knew and signed off, which is a little different from what we've heard, right? We've heard this from others saying that your effort out there was irregular, it was shadow foreign policy, characterized as a drug deal. And by the way, that was not a Democratic characterization, despite what Mr. Nunes says. That, of course, was the National Security Advisor of the United States characterizing it as a drug deal. What confuses me is that you have said and testified, and it's in here, that the Secretary of State was not only aware, but that he applauded you. Good work. Keep banging away. The Secretary of State, if this had been irregular or a drug deal or a shadow foreign policy, he would have been the one to put an end to it, and yet he did not, right?
Well, the Secretary of State, I think, was taking into account the totality of what I've been working on, globally, and saying you're doing a great job, including this.
Right. Okay. So he was aware of what you were doing, and you're doing a great job, includes this.
Yes.
So in some sense, he was validating it rather than saying this was irregular or shadow or a drug deal.
We never thought it was irregular. We thought it was in the center lane.
And why do you think the Secretary of State thought that?
Why did he think
Why did he think that this was a worthy thing to do when so many senior people, including the National Security Advisor, thought it was a drug deal?
I don't know. You'd have to ask him.
Okay. To your knowledge, did he have communications with the President about this?
I have no knowledge of his communications with the President.
Okay. Let me take you to the July 26 call that we've talked a little bit about. You basically haven't disputed Mr. Holmes's characterization of that report, although perhaps the mention of Biden, you don't recall that. I'm actually pretty confident we'll get a transcript of that call. A conversation in public between a high-profile ambassador and the President of the United States will be the top target, not for one, but for many foreign intelligence services. And because it's pretty sensitive stuff to this inquiry, and pretty sensitive stuff because this information could be used to embarrass the president or leverage public officials, my guess is we're going to see the transcript. Our people are pretty good, and if other people have it, we're going to see this transcript. Until then, all we've got is your recollection and the testimony of the other people there. So I'm curious about your frame of mind. This statement, Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not give a fig, not the word used, about Ukraine. Is that a statement you might make? Do you believe that the president doesn't give a fig about Ukraine?
Are you, Congressman, are you referring to the call or are you referring to my conversation?
So Mr. Holmes recounts, and I'll read it to you. Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not give a fig about Ukraine. Fig was not the word used there. And I'm asking you whether it's plausible that he might have heard that, because I'm asking you whether you believe that the president does not give a fig about Ukraine.
I think that's too strong. I think that based on the May 23rd meeting, the president was down on Ukraine for the reasons mentioned and would need a lot of convincing, and that's why we're pushing so hard for the meeting between the president and President Zelensky, because we thought once the two of them would meet, his impression of Ukraine, his stock about Ukraine would go up.
And what about this line? And Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant, quote unquote, big stuff that benefits the president. That's what you meant by big stuff. So again, we don't have the transcript. I suspect we will. But is that something you might say? Do you believe that the president really considers big stuff to be that which benefits him?
I don't recall saying benefits him.
No, I understand that. I'm not asking what you recalled. I'm asking whether it's plausible that you might have said that because you believe, I'm asking you what you believe right now, that the president doesn't give a fig about Ukraine and in fact cares about the big stuff that benefits the president. Do you believe that now?
I really can't opine.
Wait, I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm asking for your beliefs.
I don't understand your question. I want to answer your question. I just don't understand.
Let me try one more time.
Okay.
Do you believe what is alleged that you said on this phone call, that the president cares primarily about stuff, the big stuff that benefits the president? Is that a belief?
The president said that on the phone call. I don't think the president said that to me on the phone call. I was talking about
the time of the gentleman.
ASAP Rocky, and he mentioned investigations. I don't know why you're.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Conaway.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 6 minutes to Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Ambassador, when did it happen?
When did what happen?
The announcement. When did President Zelensky announce that the investigation was going to happen? On page 14, you said this: was there a quid pro quo? Today's your opening statement. As I testified previously, with regard to a requested White House call, White House meeting, the answer is yes, that there needed to be a public statement from President Zelensky. When the chairman asked you about the security assistance dollars, you said there needed to be a public announcement from Zelensky. So I'm asking you a simple question. When did that happen?
Never did.
Never did. They got the call July 25th. They got the meeting, not in the White House, but in New York on September 25th. They got the money on September 11th. When did the meeting happen again?
Never did.
You don't know who was in the meeting?
Which meeting are you referring to?
The meeting that never happened. Who was in it? You know how you know how Zelensky announced it? Did he tweet it? Did he do a press statement? Did he do a press conference? You know how that happened? I mean, you got all three of them wrong. They get the call, they get the meeting, they get the money. It's not 2 + 2, it's 0 for 3. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. And you told Mr. Castor that the president never told you that the announcement had to happen to get anything. In fact, he didn't just not tell you that, he explicitly said the opposite. The gentleman from Texas just read it. You said to the President of the United States, "What do you want from Ukraine?" The President, "I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. I want Zelensky to do the right thing. I want him to do what he ran on." What did he run on, Ambassador Sondland?
Transparency.
And dealing with corruption, right?
That's right.
Mr. Castor raised another important point. Why didn't you put that statement in your opening statement? I think you said you couldn't fit it in. Is that right? Said we might be here for 46 minutes instead of 45 minutes.
It wasn't purposeful, trust me.
Wasn't purposeful?
No.
Couldn't fit it in a 23-page opener. The most important statement about the subject matter at hand, the President unites in a direct conversation with you about the issue at hand, and the President says, let me read it one more time. What do you want from Ukraine, Mr. President? I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. I want this new guy, brand new guy in politics. His party just took over. I want Zelensky to do the right thing. I want him to run on and do what he ran on, which is deal with corruption. And you can't find time to fit that in a 23-page opening statement. You know what a quid pro quo is?
I do.
This for that, right? Looks to me like Ukraine got that 3 times, and there was no this. We didn't do anything. Or excuse me, they didn't have to do anything. I've never seen anything like that. And this is When the call came out, you all remember this? When the call came out, everyone said, we're going to quid pro quo. There's going to be that was what was in the call. And of course, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. Remember what the complaint said? Remember what the memo said of the whistleblower? This call was frightening. This call was scary. All those things. None of that materialized. None of that materialized. I yield back.
Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to dig a little deeper this quid pro quo. Did you not say in your opening statement and in previous testimony in closed-door hearing that you thought there was a quid pro quo?
I thought the quid pro quo was the White House visit in return for the 2016 DNC server and Burisma investigation.
So when you heard Burisma, you did not see that as code for Biden, the Bidens?
I did not.
When did you even know that? Is your testimony that you only realized that Burisma included the Bidens when the readout came out in September 25th?
No, my testimony wasn't specific as to the date because I really don't recall the date. It was very late in the game, though.
September?
I don't recall the date.
So if I told you that the legal definition of bribery was an event of offering, giving, soliciting, or receiving of any item of value as a means of influencing an action of an individual holding a public or legal duty, do you believe that not only was it quid pro quo, but it was bribery?
I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to characterize what something was or wasn't legally.
You also said in your opening statement that Secretary Perry and yourself, as well as Ambassador Volker, worked with Giuliani on the Ukraine matter as an express direction of the president. Is that right?
That's correct.
You also go on to say that we did not want to work with Giuliani. Simply put, we played the hand that we were dealt. What did you mean by that? And more importantly, what did you think would happen if you did not play that hand?
I think what you're asking me is, well, you asked it.
I did ask it.
What would happen if we didn't? It was very fragile with Ukraine at the time. There was no new ambassador. The old ambassador had left. There was a new president, and we thought it was very, very important to shore up the relationship.
In fact, you actually said, you go on to say, we all understood that if we refused to work with Mr. Giuliani, we would lose an important opportunity to cement relationships with the United States and Ukraine. So quote, we followed the president's orders. Did you see it as a directive?
I saw it as the only pathway to moving forward on Ukraine.
So you would say that the efforts that Mr. Giuliani was undertaking became a part of the formal Ukraine-U.S. policy?
I can't opine on that. All I can tell you is the president wanted us to communicate with Mr. Giuliani.
But you went on to say that you, in your opening testimony, that the suggestion that you engaged in some, quote, irregular or rogue diplomacy is absolutely false. So if in fact what Giuliani was doing was okay and proper, which is actually what you said, initially you all thought that what he was doing was not improper, right?
We did not think it was improper, and when I referred to the fact that I was not engaging in rogue diplomacy, by definition, rogue diplomacy would have meant I would not have involved the leadership of the State Department and the White House.
So you're saying that everyone in the chain of command knew about Giuliani's efforts to try to get the investigations into Burisma and to, so I'm just trying to figure out what you thought you were actually opining to.
Look, the president directed us to work with Mr. Giuliani, and the leadership of the State Department were knowledgeable, as was the NSC, that we were working with Mr. Giuliani.
Well, what's interesting is that Ambassador Taylor testified that he knew nothing about it, and clearly he would be in the chain of information if he was the ambassador to Ukraine. At the end of the day, sir, with all due respect, you're the ambassador to the European Union. Why would he not know about it?
I don't know.
He was the one who said that there was both a regular and irregular channel.
He should have known about it.
So although we don't want, although you said that you did not want to work with Mr. Giuliani, you in fact did work with him.
That's correct.
And do you think that the essence of what he was trying to achieve was accomplished?
I don't know what he was trying to achieve.
You clearly had to have known, sir. If you think that this was actually going down the center lane, is what you said, it was clearly important that we work with Mr. Giuliani to get what the president asked for because it was a directive and an order. Surely you must know whether or not mission was accomplished.
Well, I know what Mr. Giuliani communicated to us.
And you thought that that was totally fine? Did you really think that it was okay for...
Can I answer your question?
Sure.
You asked what Mr. Giuliani was trying to achieve.
No, I asked whether you thought that it was right for Mr. Giuliani to want to accomplish the efforts that he was involved in, which was to get them to investigate Burisma and the 2016 election, as you said.
All I can testify to is what I know that Mr. Giuliani either told me directly or told Ambassador Volker and others that was relayed to me.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Turner. Ambassador Sondland, I want to walk through some of the portions of your testimony because sometimes you seem to make direct connections and sometimes they seem to be dead ends. I kind of want to clear up what are the dead ends and what are the direct connections. Yesterday, Ambassador Volker, who I consider to be very talented and a man of integrity, and I believe you think he's a man of integrity, correct?
I do.
He testified that the President of the United States did not tie either a meeting with the President, a phone call, or any aid to investigations of Burisma 2016 or the Bidens, that the President did not do that. And you've testified that the President did not tell you that he tied them either, correct?
I did testify to that, although when Ambassador Volker and I were working on the statement and negotiating with the Ukrainians, it was clear to Ambassador Volker that a meeting would not happen without the Burisma in 2016. That was very clear to Ambassador Volker.
And how do you know that? What did he say to you? Because he says that was not clear to him. In fact, he says that's not the case. He was working on that. He knows that that's what the President wanted, but he didn't have it as this was a requirement.
Oh, I strongly disagree with that portion of his testimony. It was absolutely a requirement, or we would have just had the meeting and been done with it.
What about the aid? He says that they weren't tied, that the aid was not tied.
And I didn't say they were conclusively tied either. I said I was presuming it.
Okay, and so the President never told you they were tied. So your testimony, his testimony is consistent, and the President did not tie aid to investigations.
That's correct.
Okay, he also testified that he spoke to Giuliani and that Giuliani did not relate that he was tying on behalf of the President or on the President's behalf aid, and that in fact Giuliani never said to him that aid was tied to investigations. Now, the question I have for you is, did you ever have a conversation with Giuliani that did not involve Volker? Because your testimony is a lot of we's and us's. So do you and Giuliani have a separate conference, separate phone call where Giuliani told you that the aid was tied? Because Volker says, and if he was on all your phone calls, Volker says that never happened.
No, I did have a few conversations. I don't recall how many because I don't have the records with Mr. Giuliani directly when Mr. Volker wasn't available.
And did Giuliani say to you, go ahead, what were you going to say?
I don't believe I testified that Mr. Giuliani told me that aid was tied.
Oh, I think, see, this is part of the problem, Ambassador Sondland, and I just want to walk you through this, is you've said to us everyone was in the loop, and everyone knew. Now, hold on a second. I've listened to you today, as a lot of people, and not only are your answers somewhat circular, frequently you've contradicted yourself in your own answer. Now, the text messages and emails that you put up there, Kurt Volker walked us through, and he has a completely different understanding of what you were saying than what you're saying you were saying. So I'm a little confused as to how everyone's in the loop, because if Giuliani didn't give you any express statement, then it can't be that you believe this from Giuliani. Now, let me tell you right now, because is Donald Trump your friend?
No, we're not friends.
Okay. Do you like the president?
Yes.
Okay. Well, you know, after you testified, Chairman Schiff ran out and gave a press conference and said he gets to impeach the President of the United States because of your testimony. And if you pull up CNN today, right now, their banner says Sondland ties Trump to withholding aid. Is that your testimony today, Ambassador Sondland, that you have evidence that Donald Trump tied the investigation to the aid? Because I don't think you're saying that.
I've said repeatedly, Congressman, I was presuming. I also said that President Trump.
So no one told you, not just the president. Giuliani didn't tell you. Mulvaney didn't tell you. Nobody, Pompeo didn't tell you. Nobody else on this planet told you that Donald Trump was tying aid to these investigations. Is that correct?
I think I already testified.
No, answer the question. Is it correct? No one on this planet told you that Donald Trump was tying this aid to the investigations? Because if your answer is yes, then the chairman's wrong and the headline on CNN is wrong. No one on this planet told you that President Trump was tying aid to investigations. Yes or no?
Yes.
So you really have no testimony today that ties President Trump to a scheme to withhold aid from Ukraine in exchange for these investigations.
Other than my own presumption.
Which is nothing. I mean, that's what I don't understand. So you know what hearsay evidence is, Ambassador? Hearsay is when I testify what someone else told me. Do you know what made-up testimony is? Made-up testimony is when I just presume it. I mean, you're just assuming all of these things, and then you're giving them the evidence that they're running out and doing press conferences, and CNN's headline is saying that you're saying the President of the United States should be impeached because he tied aid to investigations, and you don't know that, correct?
I never said the President of the United States should be impeached.
Nope, but you did. You have left people with the confusing impression that you were giving testimony that you did not. You do not have any evidence that the President of the United States was tied to withholding aid from Ukraine in exchange for investigations. I yield back.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman. Ambassador Sondland, I really want to better understand Mr. Giuliani's role in carrying out the President's demand for investigations. So, on May the 23rd, sir, during a meeting in the Oval Office to discuss the future of U.S.-Ukraine relations, President Trump told you and others to, quote, talk to Rudy. Do I have that right, sir?
Correct.
Mr. Ambassador, did you listen to the President and talk to Rudy, sir?
Did I talk to Rudy?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
What did you understand to be Mr. Giuliani's relationship with President Trump?
I understood he was the President's personal lawyer.
What did you believe to be Mr. Giuliani? What did you believe Mr. Giuliani was doing in Ukraine for President Trump, sir?
I don't know.
Ambassador Sondland, in August of this year, you and Ambassador Volker spoke with Mr. Giuliani about a draft statement to be issued by President Zelensky. During those discussions, it was Mr. Giuliani who suggested, in fact, insisted that the statement include specific language about Burisma. Correct, sir?
Correct.
And he insisted that the statement include the mention of the 2016 elections. And Mr. Volker transmitted this message to a top Ukrainian official, right, sir?
Correct.
Mr. Ambassador, and this statement was part of the deliverable that President Trump wanted, correct, sir?
Correct.
To your knowledge, sir, was pushing the Ukrainians to investigate Burisma 2016 on the Biden's part of some official State Department policy, sir?
I never testified that we were pushing anyone to investigate the Bidens. I said Burisma.
You were involved in Ukrainian policy, right, sir?
I told you what my role was, which was quite limited and focused.
Was it your understanding, Mr. Ambassador, that Ukraine policy should involve investigations into Americans or debunk conspiracy theories about the 2016 election, sir?
What I testified was that in order to get President Zelensky a White House visit, Mr. Giuliani conveyed the notion that President Trump wanted these announcements to happen.
Of course it was not. It was a part of the president's political agenda, and it was done to benefit the president personally and politically. Were you following the president's orders, Mr. Ambassador?
I was following the president's direction to speak with Mr. Giuliani.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Just want to point out a couple things, Ambassador, in response to my colleagues. My colleagues seem to be under the impression that unless the president spoke the words, Ambassador Sondland, I am bribing the Ukrainian president, that there's no evidence of bribery. If he didn't say, Ambassador Sondland, I'm telling you I'm not going to give the aid unless they do this, that there's no evidence of a quid pro quo on military aid. But nonetheless, Ambassador, you've given us a lot of evidence of precisely that conditionality of both the White House meeting and the military assistance. You've told us, Ambassador, have you not, that you emailed the Secretary of State and said that if these investigations were announced, the new justice person was put in place, that the Ukrainians would be prepared to give the president what he wants, and that would break the logjam. You've testified and showed us documents about this, have you not, Ambassador?
I have.
And in your written statement, you say that the logjam you're referring to includes the logjam on security assistance, correct?
Correct, as my presumption.
Yes. And we also have seen, and you testified, that you have also seen Ambassador, or rather Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney himself acknowledge that the military aid was withheld in part over the investigation into 2016 that you've talked about. You referenced that as well, correct?
Correct.
Now, they also seem to say that, well, they got the money. The money may have been conditioned, but they got the money. Yes, they got caught. They got caught. Now, they still don't have the White House meeting. They made no statement. They got no meeting. The statement on the investigations was the condition to get the meeting. They didn't make the statement. They got no meeting. But they got caught. You're aware, aren't you, Ambassador, that 2 days before the aid was lifted, this inexplicable aid was lifted, Congress announced it was investigating this scheme. You're aware of that, aren't you, Ambassador?
I am now, yes.
Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to address something, a claim that you made this morning, claiming that Republicans deny Russian attempts to influence our elections. That is false, and you know it. In this committee, the Intel Committee, not the Impeachment Committee, but in this committee, time and time again, we all agreed that Russia has tried to influence American elections as far back as the Soviet Union. So I wish you would quit making that comment. Yesterday, we established with Mr. Volker something quite obvious. More than one country can try to influence our elections. See, Mr. Schiff, we didn't agree with your Russian collusion narrative, your DNC Clinton campaign coup attempt that occurred in conjunction with members of the FBI and DOJ and foreign sources, something that you have conveniently ignored as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, as you became the chairman of the Impeachment Committee. But in this process today, I'm interested in facts. I'm not a prosecutor or a defense attorney. I'm not an attorney like Mr. Turner. Ambassador Sondland, you honestly have used the words presumed, presumption, presuming, some form of the verb to presume repeatedly today. And today you said that was the problem, Mr. Goldman. No one ever told me the aid was tied to anything. I was presuming it was. You see, in mathematic fact, 2 plus 2 does equal 4. But in reality, 2 presumptions plus 2 presumptions does not equal even 1 fact. And the fact is, the president did tell you, Ambassador Sondland, no quid pro quo. That's a fact. And another fact, no quid pro quo occurred. This time I'd like to yield to Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to unanimously consent to enter into the record a Washington Post article from today that headline, Schiff's claim that the whistleblower has a statutory right to anonymity received 3 Pinocchios. Pinocchios meaning that, well, we all know what Pinocchios mean. The interpretation of that would be that, 2 interpretations. The one that my colleagues on the other side would argue is that we're trying to protect the whistleblower. An equally valid and credible interpretation is that there's something to hide, and that this unlevel playing field that's been created by the chairman's insistence that there is a statutory right to anonymity maintains that unlevel playing field and the advantages that gives them. Now, the chairman also announces at every hearing that he will not tolerate, and I agree with him, any witness intimidation, any threats, or any issues of trying to bully a witness. Ambassador Sondland, have you, your family, or your businesses received any threats or reprisals or attempts to harm you in any way?
Many.
Could you give us an example or 2?
We have countless emails, apparently, to my wife. Our properties are being picketed and boycotted?
Let's explore that one. Our own colleague, Congressman Earl Blumenauer from Oregon, has in fact called for a boycott of your hotel chain or your hotels in Oregon. I'm assuming he believes that that will harm you to the point that you will then be bullied into doing whatever he wants done. Now, my colleagues and I know that using the word bully and Earl Blumenauer in the same sentence is a bit over the top. But nevertheless, he intended to harm you and your business. Is that what you would surmise?
That's my understanding.
And that the boycotts, his call for boycott gave rise to demonstrations in front of your hotels that made your customers have to weave in and out of the demonstrators to try to actually get into the hotels?
As I understand, they're going on as we speak.
Well, the words are better put by a couple of other Oregonians. It says, Congressman Blumenauer's irresponsible attempt to hurt a homegrown business that supports hundreds of jobs in our local economy is just shameful and ought to be an outrage to all Oregonians. Some fellow named McDermott. And then a lady named Ellen Carmichael, who I believe works for you, said, we are saddened to have our Congressman Earl Blumenauer call for a boycott that would put the livelihoods of thousands of his constituents in peril. The attack on our employees is unwarranted. And I couldn't agree more, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Blumenauer should not be using the vast influences that we as members of Congress have to bully you and your businesses and to harm the hundreds or thousands of employees that operate in your business by trying to take business away from you, to force you into doing something that they wanted you to do, which is actually testify, and you've actually done that. But that's a shame for that. And I'm hopeful that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will join me in saying, Mr. Blumenauer, you really shouldn't be using your congressional influence to try to bully and threaten a witness before these proceedings. That is just wrong. I'm going to look forward to my colleague's response, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman.
Ms. Spear.
I was somewhat humored by your request that Mr. Blumenauer not bully to get something done when all we're talking about is the president bullying to get something he wants done. But having said that, I'd like to clarify one point about the whistleblower protection from the article that Mr. Conway just provided. The law reads, expressly restricts the Inspector General's office from disclosing whistleblowers' identities. It says, quote, the Inspector General shall not disclose the identity of the employee without the consent of the employee unless the Inspector General determines that such disclosure is unavoidable during the course of the investigation or the disclosure is made to an official of the Department of Justice responsible for determining whether a prosecution should be undertaken. Unquote. That appears to be the lone statutory restriction on disclosing a whistleblower's identity, applicable only to the Inspector General's office. We found no court rulings on whether whistleblowers have a right to anonymity under the ICWPA or related statutes. Vladeck said it is nonetheless a best practice to avoid disclosure of the Ukraine whistleblower's identity, given the concerns about retaliation. McCulloch said, we've stepped into bizarro land when senior policymakers are trying to yank a CIA employee into the public spotlight in retaliation for making a whistleblowing complaint, especially when they are credible threats to that employee's personal safety. And I don't know why our colleagues on the other side of the aisle...
Did you lady yield?
No, I'm afraid I only have 3 minutes, so I have some other issues, but thank you.
Well, the end of the article does go through that and also says it's 3 Pinocchios in spite of that conversation.
Well, the President of the United States has 5 Pinocchios on a daily basis, so let's not go there. Ambassador Sondland, in your deposition, you lamented, quote, I was truly disappointed that the State Department prevented me at the last minute from testifying earlier on October 8th, 2019. But your issuance of a subpoena has supported my appearance here today, and I'm pleased to provide the following testimony. So it is clear that the White House, the State Department, did not want you to testify at that deposition. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And since then, you have on numerous occasions during your opening statement today indicated that you have not been able to access documents in the State Department. Is that correct?
Correct.
So you have been hampered in your ability to provide testimony to this committee. Is that correct?
I've been hampered to provide completely accurate testimony without the benefit of those documents.
In terms of your conversations with the President of the United States, what percentage of your conversations were about Ukraine as compared to your other duties?
I don't recall.
Well, you've only had 6 conversations or 7 conversations with the President, you said. So
About Ukraine, I think.
So you've had many other conversations?
Oh, yeah, about unrelated, completely unrelated matters.
So how many conversations with the President of the United States have you had?
Again, I don't want to give you a number because it's going to be wrong if I don't have the records.
Is it less than 20?
It's probably in that range.
All right. Would you say that delay in military aid and the lack of a meeting in the White House works to the benefit of Russia?
Repeat the question again, please.
Would you say that the delay in military aid to Ukraine and the reluctance to have a White House meeting has a benefit to Russia?
I think it could be looked that way, yes. Looked at that way.
All right, I'm going to just speak very briefly about code. When Michael Cohen was before the Oversight Committee, he was asked, you suggest the President sometimes communicates his wishes indirectly. For example, you say, quote, Mr. Trump did not directly tell me to lie to Congress. That's not how he operates. It would be different, he said, he doesn't give you questions. He doesn't give you orders. He speaks in code. And I understand the code because I've been around him for a decade. So do you think that the President was speaking in code when he would talk about wanting investigations?
I can't characterize how the President was speaking. Every conversation I've had with the President has been fairly direct and straightforward.
All right, that I yield back.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request.
You may state your request.
The DOE responds to Ambassador Sondland's comments before the House Intelligence Committee attributable to the DOE Secretary of the Press Secretary. Ambassador Sondland's testimony today misrepresented both Secretary Perry's interaction and with Rudy Giuliani and direction the Secretary received from President Trump. As previously stated, Secretary Perry spoke to Rudy Giuliani only once at the President's request. No one else was on that call. At no point before, during, or after the phone call did the words Biden or Burisma ever come up in the presence of Secretary Perry. Again, I ask that that be entered into the record.
Without objection, although I would note that they've also refused to come and testify under oath.
The American people expect a lot of things out of politics. Arguments, protests, we certainly see that. Clash of principles and ideas. I think sometimes eventually they actually would like to see some compromise. But I think something they expect above everything else, fundamental, they expect that there is a sense of fairness about it. And I want to read part of a text I received from someone that I have tremendous respect for. Just a few hours ago, she wrote, crafting a story to hurt another human being can never be right. The means of destroying and hurting another individual just does not justify the end, and politics does not give anyone free pass to destroy other people. Now, you can say a lot about the treatment of President Trump over the last 3 years, but I think one thing you cannot argue is that it has been fair. There were those calling for his impeachment literally before he was inaugurated. For 2.5 years, we were told every single day he has betrayed our country. He is a Russian asset. He has committed treason. Accusations that we know now are not true, and for which we never had any evidence to support that. He was accused of obstruction, and now here we are actually impeaching the president over, well, first, quid pro quo, until we found out that didn't poll very well with focus groups, and then it was bribery, until virtually every witness before us who was asked a question said they had no evidence of bribery, and now it's extortion. And again, the American people expect some sense of fairness. So when Nancy Pelosi goes before she has seen a shred of evidence, and she announces the president has betrayed his oath of office, he has betrayed the American people, he betrayed national security, without seeing any evidence, again, the American people say, well, what is fair about that? So the question before us now is, again, extortion. That's the latest version of the charges against the president. I'm not an attorney. Extortion sounds pretty scary. It's kind of serious. I had to look it up what it means. It means obtaining money or property by threat to a victim's property or loved ones. Mr. Ambassador, I'm going to read you a couple quotes from President Zelensky and then ask you a question. First, from a Ukrainian press release, Donald Trump is convinced that the new Ukrainian government will be able to quickly improve the image of Ukraine, complete investigation of corruption, which inhibited the interaction with Ukraine and the USA. Does that sound like President Zelensky is being bribed or extorted in that comment?
As I testified previously, I'm not a lawyer either, and I don't want to characterize any legal terms.
That's fine. I think most people would read that and say that doesn't sound like he's under severe pressure. He makes it very clear in his own words then. Ukrainian President Zelensky told reporters during a joint press conference with Donald Trump that he was not pressured by the U.S. president. Again, I was not pressured. He used another time. There was no blackmail. I would ask you, do you think he felt like he was being extorted by the president based on these comments?
I really think that's for the committee and the Congress to.
Well, you know what, Mr. Ambassador, it's really for the American people.
I agree.
And the American people aren't stupid. And the American people can hear that, and they can say, I don't think he was under duress. I don't think he was being extorted. I don't think there was an exchange of a bribe. And I would conclude with this last observation. It is common for our national policy to withhold aid for various reasons. You know that's true as an ambassador. Is that not true?
That's true.
It's frequent, isn't it, that we will withhold aid for various reasons.
That's correct.
It is a policy. I mean, for example, President Bush did it. He suspended military aid to 35 countries over their lack of support for the International Criminal Court. I'll bet that helped his political standing back home. But I don't remember anyone suggesting we should impeach him for it. President Trump did it last year with Afghanistan over corruption. We did it with Pakistan over much the same thing. And no one suggested that we impeach them for it. This is a common occurrence in international relations. It is hardly an impeachable offense.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir, for being here today. You know, there are things we can agree with our colleagues on, things we can disagree. I can agree that with my colleague that we should turn over all the documents should be turned over. Mr. Ambassador, I think you agree that it would have helped your testimony, helped you understood that the State Department, the White House hasn't turned over a single document. The White House won the President's April phone conversation, but millions more out there. So on that we can agree. On others we can disagree as to, particularly as it relates to the whistleblower. It distresses me because I begin to wonder about the motivations. In the final analysis, the way I look at this is if we were investigating an arson, you all would indict the person who pulled the fire alarm. That person's job is done, and we've seen the smoke and we've seen the fire. Whatever the whistleblower did doesn't change the president's actions, doesn't change the president's own words, which are in our testimony, are in our body of evidence. It doesn't change Mr. Mulvaney's own words. It doesn't change the body of evidence here. All it does is put this person at risk. Back to the documents and what you know, and clearly, Mr. Ambassador, you seem to have your memory jogged by documents. Let's talk about May 23rd and see if this one helps you. Senator Johnson, in referencing the May 23rd meeting in his letter, sir, says, I have no recollection of the president saying that during the meeting. It is entirely possible he did because I do not work for the president. If made, the comment simply did not register with me. He also says, I also remember Sondland staying behind to talk to the president as the rest of the delegation left the Oval Office. Sir, do you recall this later conversation and what you and the president discussed?
I do.
And what was that? Just
Again, recapping what it was sort of a free-for-all conversation, and I wanted to tie down exactly what we agreed to do and what we didn't.
And in that subsequent, he reinforced talk to Rudy? And
Talk to Rudy. You guys should work on this.
Did he go into any more detail about what that meant?
No.
Just said, talk to Rudy.
It was a very short conversation.
And the second part, you said there was something besides just talk to Rudy?
Yeah, to reconfirm that the three of us would be working on the Ukraine file.
Yeah, and
so on.
Back to Rudy in this seemingly contradictory messages here. You now recall the prerequisite mentioned in the July 10th meeting, right? That when you were having this discussion, the first meeting in John Bolton's office, sir?
Yes.
You referenced that there was a condition?
I believe someone else testified that I raised that, and I didn't dispute that testimony, that I said it's my understanding that in order to get this visit done, there needs to be an announcement about, I don't know if I said investigations or said specifically Burisma and
Sure, but in your opening, you mentioned at the very same time that apparently there was a meeting with Rudy Giuliani, and the message you got was underscored, very concerned about what Lutsenko told them, that according to RG, Rudy Giuliani, the Z POTUS meeting will not happen, which is not conditioned. It's just not going to happen. Your understanding of the difference here?
I think what you're saying is this meeting I was talking about in my opening statement was apparently a meeting that Rudy Giuliani was having
at the same time.
At the same time in Ukraine.
Right.
Unbeknownst to us.
Right. But he's saying something different. He's saying it's not going to happen. There's no notice in here that it's conditioned in any way.
Well, that was Ambassador Volker's point. This was really an exchange with Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Volker. Ambassador Volker is saying, don't let other people speak for the U.S. government. That was his point.
But if Rudy is following the directions and he's saying what he's saying here, and you're also following directions, right? And you're saying it's conditioned, who's giving you the instructions to say what you're saying?
That's why we thought it was problematic to work with Mr. Giuliani.
Exactly. But who did you work with to say the things that you said? Did you have conversations with the Chief of Staff, with Secretary Pompeo to say what you were saying? You didn't just say this on your own.
Are you talking about in the July 10th meeting?
That's correct.
Oh, yeah, with Ambassador Volker, because at that point, Ambassador Volker was the one in touch with Mr. Giuliani, not me.
But you had no direct conversations with Mr. Mulvaney about this or Secretary Pompeo to make this condition statement?
Only the texts and emails that I've already reviewed.
Thank you. My time is up.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Ambassador Sondland, for your service. And I also want to thank you for your recognition in your opening statement of your hardworking staff at the U.S. mission to the EU. Mr. Sondland, you testified that you never received any direct confirmation or specific information as to why there was a hold on aid.
That's correct.
And in fact, you testified, quote, President Trump never told me directly that the aid was conditioned on the investigations, end quote.
That's correct.
You said, quote, never heard those words from the president, correct?
Correct.
Instead, you testified that in your September 9th call with President Trump, the president said, quote, no quid pro quo. I want nothing. I want nothing. I want President Zelensky to do the right thing, do what he ran on, end quote. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the fact is, the aid was given to Ukraine without any announcement of new investigations.
That's correct.
And President Trump did, in fact, meet with President Zelensky in September at the United Nations, correct?
He did.
And there was no announcement of investigations before this meeting?
Correct.
And there was no announcement of investigations after this meeting?
That's right.
And you've been very clear when Chairman Schiff has asked you broadly about investigations. You've corrected that to say specifically your understanding of investigations are investigation into the 2016 elections and investigations into Burisma. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And are you aware that during the Obama administration, the U.S. partnered with the UK and Ukraine on an investigation into the owner of Burisma as part of Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts?
I became aware of it today during the hearing.
Other witnesses have testified, but yes. And in fact, The Obama administration State Department was concerned about the potential appearance of conflict of interest with Hunter Biden serving on the board of Burisma because they raised this as they were preparing Ambassador Yovanovitch for her Senate confirmation. Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of it.
She testified, when I asked her that question, both in the open hearing and the closed deposition. And I've asked most of our witnesses this, and every witness I've asked has said yes. And I want to ask you this today. Do you believe that Hunter Biden having a position on the board of Burisma has the potential appearance of a conflict of interest?
I don't want to characterize Hunter Biden's service on the board one way or another. I just don't know enough.
So you disagree with every other witness that has answered yes, there is a potential appearance of a conflict of interest?
Well, you asked if there was a conflict or an appearance of
potential, my quote was the potential appearance of a conflict of interest.
I didn't hear the word appearance. Well, clearly it's an appearance of a conflict.
Correct. Clearly it is an appearance of conflict of interest. Again, this is something that every witness has answered yes to or agreed with it could have a potential appearance, and yet we are not allowed to call Hunter Biden to answer questions in front of this committee. Thank you again for your truthful testimony today, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Swalwell.
Ambassador Sondland, you were told by the president and others to not show up. You showed up. I think that says a lot about you, and I think history will look kindly on you doing that. But there are consequences to that, and just a couple hours ago, President Trump was asked about you, and he said, I don't know him well. I have not spoken to him much. This is not a man I know well. Is that true?
It really depends on what you mean by know well. We are not close friends. No, we have a professional, cordial working relationship.
And in that working relationship, he knows who you are?
Yes.
And he has spoken to you often?
What's often?
Well, you said at least 20 times.
Okay, if that's often, then it's often.
And you donated $1 million to his inaugural committee, is that right?
I bought a VVIP ticket to the inauguration.
That's a lot of money, isn't it?
It's a lot of money.
And after that, the president makes you ambassador to the European Union. Eventually, the ambassador to Ukraine is removed. And as you told us in your deposition, you become a central figure as it relates to Ukraine. That's a pretty big responsibility, right?
Well, I don't know that I said I was a central figure. I was one of several people who were tasked to work on the Ukraine file.
And would you ever, in that big responsibility, take any actions that were not authorized by President Trump?
Well, by President Trump or the leadership in the State Department.
Were you ever hauled into the leadership of the State Department for any actions you had taken around your work on Ukraine?
No.
As to Rudy Giuliani, on May 23rd, the president told you, talk to Rudy. You talked to him a couple times. You, as you told us in September, talked to the president a couple times. Did the president ever say to you, stop talking to Rudy?
No.
Did he ever say, don't any longer talk to Rudy?
No.
On Ukraine, you said that you were playing the hand you were dealt. President Trump was the dealer, wasn't he?
President Trump was what?
The dealer. In your metaphor, you were playing the hand you were dealt. The dealer is President Trump. Is that right?
I'll recharacterize your question by saying we followed the direction of the president because that was the only pathway to working with Ukraine.
On page 4 of your testimony, you said, given what we knew at the time, what we were asked to do did not appear to be wrong. And you would agree now, Ambassador, knowing what you know now, what you did not know at the time, there are some things around Ukraine that were wrong.
I agree.
So let's take out any leveraging of security assistance over the Ukrainians in a White House visit. Would you agree that it is wrong for the President of the United States to ask the leader of a foreign government to investigate the President of the United States' political opponent?
Yes.
Would you agree that in addition to making that request for an investigation, leveraging a visit at the White House that a foreign government leader desperately needs is also wrong?
Leveraging in what respect?
A meeting at the White House. If someone really needs a meeting at the White House to show their legitimacy to their people, that leveraging that meeting and asking for an investigation would be wrong?
Well, to be candid, Congressman, every meeting at the White House has conditions placed on it. I've never worked on a meeting at the White House that doesn't have a host of conditions placed.
But if one of those conditions is to investigate a political opponent, you would agree that would be wrong?
The political opponent, yes, but making announcements or investigations per se, no.
And if you asked a foreign government leader to investigate your political opponent, leveraged a White House meeting, and leveraged security assistance, in this hypothetical, you would agree all three of those are wrong?
In the hypothetical, yes, I would agree.
Now, you, before becoming an ambassador, worked as a businessman, and I presume you worked on a lot of deals, is that right?
Correct.
Involving millions of dollars?
Correct.
You work for a guy now who wrote a book called Art of the Deal, is that right?
I do.
And State Department employees have told us that they don't want to make legal definitions around what occurred with the White House meeting being leveraged against the investigations, but you plainly call it a quid pro quo, is that right?
I did.
And finally, one final hypothetical. If someone walks through those two doors wearing rain boots, a raincoat, and holding an umbrella with raindrops falling off of them, do you have to see outside that it's raining to presume or conclude that it might be raining outside?
I understand your hypothetical.
I yield back.
Thank you.
Ms. Hurd.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, good to see you.
Good to see you.
My colleague from California basically implied that you've been supportive of President Trump's campaign. Is that correct?
I'm having a very hard time hearing you, sir.
My colleague from California indicated that you were supportive of the president's campaign. Is that correct?
I actually donated to the inaugural committee in order to secure tickets.
So let me ask this question. Did you participate in or overhear any conversations about the potential information collected by Ukraine on the Bidens, collected by Ukrainians on the Bidens would be used for political gain?
Did I personally hear that? No.
Did you participate in any conversations when this was being discussed?
Not that I recall.
In your statement on page 5, you said Mr. Giuliani's request for a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. And you also recounted your conversation with President Trump where he says, I want nothing, no quid pro quo. How do you reconcile these two statements?
They're hard to reconcile. We were working along Mr. Giuliani's direction for a period of time. We still didn't have a White House meeting. Aid was now held up. There were lots of reasons being given by various people as to why those weren't moving forward. And I finally got exasperated by receiving Ambassador Taylor's latest text, and I just picked up the phone. I got through the president, and I said, what do you want?
Sure. Are you aware of any specific conversations Mayor Giuliani had with the president between your May 23rd conversation and September 11th, 2019?
I don't recall if Mayor Giuliani, when I was directly talking to him, either through a conference call or on a direct call, whether he quoted from the president or said, I just talked to the president. Most of the communications, as I said, went through Ambassador Volker initially. So I don't want to opine on what may or may not have been said.
On page 11 of your testimony, you said Mr. Giuliani had been communicating with Ukrainians without our knowledge. I'm assuming you're believing you Mr. Volker, and Ambassador Taylor. Which Ukrainians was Rudy Giuliani communicating with?
Well, I was specifically referring to this text that I received from Ambassador Volker, where Mr. Giuliani was apparently telling the Ukrainians something that frustrated Ambassador Volker.
Sure. So who specifically? Right. We know that
Mr. Lutsenko, the old prosecutor.
And do you think Mr. Lutsenko has any gravitas within the Zelensky regime?
I don't know. He was the old attorney general and
ultimately got fired in August when the new group came in. Okay, so we know Rudy Giuliani has met with Mr. Yermak on the fringes of meetings, and I think it was Spain. Do you know any other Ukrainian official within the Zelensky regime that Mayor Giuliani was meeting with?
I don't know who Mr. Giuliani was meeting with.
Had you had any conversations with Ukrainian officials within the Zelensky regime that came to you and said, hey, I just got off the phone with Giuliani, what the hell is he talking about?
I don't recall.
Would that be normal? In all your interactions with ambassadors and heads of states and governments, if there is some element of the U.S. government that they have spoken to, isn't it usually the step that they come in, talk to the ambassador, try to clarify what that statement was? Is that a true characterization of how elements of diplomacy work?
I think that's a reasonable possibility. Things work all kinds of different ways these days.
When you met with President Zelensky after the July 25th phone call, so you met him on July 26th, did the investigations or Joe Biden come up in that meeting?
I don't recall Joe Biden coming up.
Was there any frustration expressed to you by the phone call that happened the day before?
No, as I testified, everyone said it was a good call.
Is, in your opinion, your interactions with President Zelensky, is he a straight shooter? Is he a liar? Or is he a liar?
He impressed me greatly, and that's why I wanted to get he and President Trump together as soon as possible.
And so when he makes express statements, you tend to believe them?
Yeah, with my limited interaction with him, he seems very honorable.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I hope you make your plane.
Thank you, Mr. Hurd.
I yield back.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Ambassador. Welcome. Others close to President Trump have made it clear that investigations were in fact part of the conditions for U.S. assistance to Ukraine, including Rudy Giuliani and Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff. So, Ambassador Sondland, at a press conference on October 17th, acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney discussed his belief that it's entirely appropriate to politicize U.S. foreign policy. Ambassador, how often did you speak or meet with Mr. Mulvaney?
Again, based on my lack of records, I'm going by a bad memory.
Just based on your memory.
I only think I had one formal meeting with Mr. Mulvaney, and it had nothing to do with Ukraine. It had to do with a completely unrelated matter.
So, did you have a chance to talk with Ms. Mulvaney about your efforts in the Ukraine?
I think most of our communication were through the stream of emails, which others were on, generally. And I may have seen him at the White House casually and said hello and, kept in touch, but we didn't have a back and forth.
Well, let me ask you this. Was it your sense that Mr. Mulvaney had a direct line to President Trump? He must have as acting chief of staff, is that right?
Of course.
Let us look at what Mr. Mulvaney said during his October 17th press conference.
Those were the driving factors. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely, no question about that. But that's it, and that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
So the demand for an investigation into the Democrats was part of the reason that it was ordered to withhold funding to Ukraine.
The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation. And that is absolutely appropriate.
He said that President Trump, in that clip, had an interest in the investigations, did he not?
Apparently, yes.
He's the chief of staff. He's somebody that sees the president and has conversation with the president every single day. Wouldn't you expect that?
Just described as a quid pro quo.
I would expect he has a direct line to the president.
Ambassador Sondland, when did you first learn from Mr. Mulvaney that the investigations were holding up the security assistance, if at any time?
I don't know that I heard it from Mr. Mulvaney.
Okay. And Ambassador Sondland, I know that you're not a career Foreign Service officer. Is it your understanding that the U.S. government conditions security assistance on an investigation into a political rival all the time?
I've already testified I didn't think that would be proper.
All right. Well, let us also see what Mr. Mulvaney had to say about that at the same press conference.
Those were the driving factors. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
I'll just go ahead and read it for you because this thing. I'll read it. He says, and I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy. Knowing what you know now about what was intended with Ukraine, do you agree with Mr. Mulvaney that there's just going to be political influence in foreign policy, or that we should all just get over it and allow a president now or later to investigate a political rival and ask a foreign government to do that? Do you agree with Mr. Mulvaney?
I think there's a big difference between political influence and investigating a rival, because politics enters into everything relating to foreign policy.
So, but you disagree that you agree that the president should not be allowed to ask for the investigation of a political rival?
In the context of what was going on in Ukraine, I believe that the president should not investigate a political rival in return for a quid pro quo.
And part of the way that you figured out that all of this stuff that was going on, that you were part of something that was basically wrong, is because in the July 25th phone call, the president himself, he didn't tell you, we don't know if he told Rudy Giuliani or not, because Rudy Giuliani won't come in here. He said directly to the president of Ukraine that he wanted the Bidens investigated. Wasn't that your reading of the call?
First of all, I don't believe that I was a part of something that was wrong, because based on what I knew, I thought we were operating well within the center lane of proper U.S. diplomacy.
I yield back.
Mr. Ratcliffe.
Chairman, thank you. Ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement issued this morning from the Office of the Vice President by Chief of Staff Mark Short.
Without objection.
Ambassador Sondland, I'll be brief. In anticipation of Mr. Holmes's testimony tomorrow about this July 26 phone call that he overheard at a cafe in Kiev that you had with President Trump, he overheard that even though the call was not on speakerphone, correct?
I don't believe so.
All right. Was it an open air cafe?
It was outdoors.
One of the points that my Democratic colleagues keep making is that David Holmes's prior testimony, which he'll apparently confirm tomorrow, is that President Trump said that he doesn't give a blank about Ukraine. You heard that earlier?
That was not on the phone call. I don't think he testified that was on the phone call. I think he was testifying that I summarized the phone call, and I don't recall saying that.
And you have no recollection of that?
I don't.
Yeah. Even if it was true, there's nothing wrong with that, to have an opinion about.
He can have whatever opinion he wants about Ukraine.
It's all part of the narrative that President Trump is a bad guy, that he doesn't care about the Ukrainians. But it seems to me, Ambassador Sondland, that nothing says you care more about the Ukrainians than sending Javelin anti-tank missiles. Do you agree with me?
I agree that sending Javelin anti-tank missiles is something the Ukraine wanted and needed.
Certainly, those work a lot better in stopping Russian tanks than the blankets that were sent by the Obama administration.
Your point is taken.
I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Heck. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador, thank you for your stamina, sir. A few quick, fairly easy questions. You would agree, would you not, sir, that foreign interference in our elections is or can be a threat to our democracy?
Under certain conditions, yes.
There are conditions under which their interference is not a threat?
I'm sorry, did you say foreign interference?
Yes.
Always, sorry.
And do you also agree that identifying and preventing that interference should be a priority of the federal government?
It should be one of its priorities.
And when you were assisting President Trump in his effort to obtain those investigations, did you at all realize that those investigations could in fact impact the 2020 election?
No.
Do you believe, sir, that it is ever appropriate to invite, press, bribe, or coerce foreign interference in our elections?
No.
Thank you. I want to refer to something that you said in your opening statement. As I previously testified, had I known of all of Mr. Giuliani's dealings,
or of his associations with individuals now under criminal indictment, I would not have acquiesced to his participation. It's hard to read that without believing that you thought that what he was doing was either wrong or that he was not reputable. Fair?
Well, with 20/20 hindsight, that's fair.
Yes. You've testified here today that you also came to believe that the request for investigations into Burisma was in fact a request to investigate the Bidens, both former Vice President and Hunter. And indeed, the transcript of the July 25th call makes specific reference to that, including Hunter Biden. And today, even the ranking member said we could clear all this up if we could have Hunter Biden. And I have a simple question. What Ukrainian law did Hunter Biden violate?
I'm not aware.
What evidence is there that he may have violated any Ukrainian law?
I'm not aware.
That's because there is none, sir. Finally, also from your opening statement, you said, as you know, I have already provided 10 hours of deposition testimony. I did so despite directives from the White House and the State Department that I refused to appear as many others have done. I agreed to testify because I respect the gravity of the moment, and I believe I have an obligation to account fully for my role in these events. By obligation, you mean simply your legal obligation, or did you mean something bigger?
Well, both my legal obligation and my moral obligation.
Your moral obligation. I actually want to present an alternative theory. Your family came here escaping the Holocaust via Uruguay, and your parents moved Lucy and later you here, where, frankly, you've been an American success story through dint of hard work and innovation, good idea, a knack to hire the right people, and some luck. You've built a considerable, successful business, one that I know for a fact would make your parents proud. They came here because they knew that it was here that they could have freedom that they had not enjoyed, security that they had not enjoyed, an opportunity that they had not enjoyed. And no doubt, on some level, you're grateful, and it's created a sense of patriotism in you. Is that fair to say?
Very fair.
Why then, sir, with your courage to come before us, does that same standard not apply to Mr. Mulvaney, Mr. Duffy, Mr. Pompeo, Mr. Bolton, Mr. Vogt, Mr. Giuliani? Why shouldn't those same sentiments beat within their hearts to do their patriotic duty and do what you have done, sir? Indeed, why doesn't that same standard apply to the President of the United States?
I wish I could answer.
I suspect you can't because there is no good answer. But I do appreciate your willingness to come here today. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman.
Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney.
Without objection, we haven't seen all these statements, but I presume they are accurate and no objection.
Thank you. Ambassador, President Trump's not a big fan of foreign aid. Is that right?
I don't know if that's a fair characterization. I think he's careful.
He's expressed concerns about foreign aid going to certain countries. Okay, fair enough. And he knew Ukraine was corrupt. Is that right?
He believed Ukraine was corrupt.
Yeah, and he wanted Europe to do more?
Definitely.
Definitely wanted Europe to do more. And the president had a belief that Ukrainian government officials, some senior Ukrainian government officials, supported his opponent in 2016. I won't go into all the details, but I think of the one member of parliament who said the majority of Ukrainian politicians want Hillary Clinton to win. So he had that belief as well. And obviously he understood what was happening. We got a brand new guy in Ukraine. This Zelensky guy wins, right?
Right.
And his party takes over, and President Trump wants to see, with all these other things that are of concern to him, he wants to see if this new guy is actually, as I like to say, the real deal, a real reformer, and actually going to deal with the corruption problem. So aid gets held up for 55 days. Gets held up on July 18th, and then is released on September 11th. But it seems to me more important than the 55-day pause is the 14 days. When Ukraine realized aid was held up on the 29th, we've now had you testify to that. The two witnesses yesterday testified that, the Politico article. So aid gets held up on Ukraine learns aid is held on August 29th, and then, of course, released on September 11th. In those 14 days, there are 3 important meetings with senior government officials and President Zelensky. There's the August 29th meeting between Ambassador Bolton and President Zelensky. There's the meeting September 1st that you're a part of. Vice President Pence meets with President Zelensky. And then there's the meeting on September 5th where U.S. Senators Murphy and Johnson meet with President Zelensky. None of those meetings did any linkage to security assistance dollars and an announcement or start of any investigation ever come up. None of them. But it seems to me the one that's the most important is probably the one we've talked least about, and that's the September 5th meeting. Because that's actually a meeting where there is no one, well, it's much more congressional focused than White House focused. This is the meeting where Senators Murphy and Johnson, bipartisan, meet with President Zelensky. And what's interesting is what both senators in the last 2 days have given us letters recounting what happened in that meeting. Senator Murphy said, I broached the topic of pressure on Zelensky from Rudy Giuliani and the president's other emissaries to launch investigations into Trump's political rival. Murphy brought it up. You got 2 senators who both strong supporters of money going to Ukraine. These guys are all for it. And Senator Murphy, the Democrat, even brings up the issue everyone's been talking about. It seems to me if ever there was going to be a time where the president of Ukraine says, guys, you don't know what I'm dealing with. I'm getting pressure from the president of the United States. He wants me to do this. I got to make it. It seems if ever there was a time that the president of Ukraine, the new guy, who now knows the aid has been on hold, if ever there was a time to bring it up, that would have been the time. But guess what? At no time, Senator Johnson tells us, at no time during this meeting or on any other meeting on this trip was there any mention by Zelensky or any other Ukrainian that they were feeling pressure to do anything in return for military aid. Not even, Senator Johnson says, not even after Murphy warned them about getting involved in the election. So Murphy gave this big deal on Giuliani and nothing. And guess what Murphy also said? I do not dispute any of Senator Johnson's factual representations regarding the meeting. If ever it was going to happen, September 5th was the day. No one from the White House there, not Ambassador Bolton, not Vice President, no one there. But even then it didn't happen. And we got all kinds of other meetings when it didn't happen. And of course, as you testified earlier, there was never an announcement. You said there were 3 quid pro quos, but there weren't, because there was never an announcement. I mean, this is as clear as it gets, but these guys want to keep stirring it up based on no direct evidence whatsoever. And the best direct evidence we have is actually what the president told you. I want nothing. There is no quid pro quo. I want Zelensky to do exactly what he campaigned on. And when that became clear to us, guess what? They got the money. They got the money. God bless America. It all worked out, right? This is crazy what we're going through because the facts are so darn clear. I yield back.
Mr. Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, I'm impressed with your career. Been very successful in business. I'm impressed with your commitment to public service. And I was very impressed with your forthright statement. So thank you for that. You said it was the highest honor for you to have this opportunity to have this appointment to serve as ambassador to the EU, correct?
Correct.
And you quickly became very involved in the Ukraine policy. And that policy has been described by you and others, was really very clear. Help Ukraine fight internal corruption and resist external aggression, correct?
Correct.
And this Congress, I think with the support of everybody up here, Republicans and Democrats, and in fact with a significant amount of Republican leadership, authorized the release of military aid, right?
Right.
And you and others who were working with you believed it was very important to the new government, President Zelensky, to have that White House meeting to show our support and send a signal to Russia, correct?
That's correct.
And from hearing you and from hearing our other witnesses, Ambassador Yovanovitch, Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Taylor, there was a concerted team effort on your part to get that meeting and release that aid, correct?
Well, there was always a concerted effort on my part to get the meeting. That was my singular narrow focus, was to get the meeting.
Right, and that was shared by all of the colleagues I just mentioned, correct?
Yes.
All right, and incredibly urgent, Ambassador Taylor described going to the front where Ukrainians were dying at the Donbass. 14,000 had died, and it was an existential issue for them that they get the aid. And you were well aware of that and shared, I'm sure, Ambassador Taylor's concern. Is that correct?
I did.
Right. And in your forthright testimony, you've testified, and it's really with the benefit of hindsight because you couldn't piece it all together. You know, Giuliani knew in real time what you were trying to figure out as you went along. Is that a fair statement?
I think so.
One, you testified that you acted on the orders of the president. That was you acting on his orders, correct?
Correct.
And you said quite explicitly there was a quid pro quo.
Relating to the meeting and the Burisma DNC.
That's exactly right. No meeting unless there's an investigation, right?
That's what we were told by Mr. Giuliani.
All right. And Mr. Giuliani, you absolutely...
Wait, no meeting unless there was an announcement of investigation.
Okay, thank you. And I asked, by the way, did the efforts of Mr. Giuliani authorized by the president impede the efforts that you and others were making to try to advance what you thought was the Ukraine policy?
Not initially. We were just working toward...
Ultimately?
Well, ultimately nothing happened.
Right. And Giuliani was the one who was absolutely insistent on the meeting, correct?
Giuliani was insistent on the
investigation.
Yeah.
All right. Now, I asked this of Ambassador Taylor or Ambassador Volker. If the mayor of Portland said to the police chief, I'm not going to authorize your budget unless you agree to do an investigation into my political opponent, would that be wrong?
Of course.
And likewise, if it were the governor of the state of Oregon doing the same thing, correct?
Correct.
And would that same rule apply to the President of the United States?
To investigate a political opponent? Yes.
That's correct.
Yes.
All right, so that's the question here. The President, in his phone call, he asked President Zelensky, who desperately needed the release of that aid, who desperately needed the White House meeting, to do an investigation, and it was focused on the Bidens and Hunter Biden in Burisma, in CrowdStrike. I mean, you don't have to answer that. The President's words speak for themselves. Do you feel, as a person who went into public service to serve, who had a team of people that shared your desire to help Ukraine, do you feel in any way betrayed by the double dealing of the President? It's a real question.
I don't want to characterize...
You don't have to characterize him. I'm just, you know, we all, if we get a chance to do something useful, we like to do it. And there's no better joy than when you're doing it with other people.
Mr. Welch, let me answer your question this way. I would have preferred that, and I'm sure everyone would have preferred, that the President simply met with Mr. Zelensky right away. Our assessment of Mr. Zelensky was that he and the President would get on famously. He was smart, he was funny, he was charming, he was the kind of person the President would like. And once the two of them got together, we thought the chemistry would take over and good things would happen between the U.S. and Ukraine relationship. That's why we were pushing for a quick, unconditional meeting.
So it's unfortunate that he was unwilling to meet without the commitment on the investigation. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Ambassador, let's pick up right there. You would have preferred if they just had the meeting with the President of Ukraine without these conditions. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
But there were these conditions, and it involved an investigation. right?
Well, remember,
many times.
the initial invitation that the president sent to President Zelensky had no conditions.
Well, but that didn't last very long, did it? And then there were conditions. This is not controversial at this point, I don't believe, sir. There were conditions that the president wanted investigations, right?
Right.
And you thought they were Burisma and the 2016 election.
Correct.
We now know, of course, that Burisma means Biden's, right?
Today we do.
And we can probably, from today until the end of time, set aside any confusion that when somebody's asking for an investigation of Burisma over the summer, what they really meant was Biden's, right?
With 2020 hindsight, yes.
Right, with hindsight. And of course, on the day after the president's famous call, you're having lunch with David Holmes, we've covered this, and he overhears your conversation. And I know you said you have no reason to dispute what Mr. Holmes said. And I think you said you wouldn't have any reason to believe, to think you didn't speak about investigations with the president. The president raised investigations with you, right?
Correct.
On the 26th.
Correct.
And we now know, of course, that was about the Bidens and Burisma in 2016, right? I mean, I know you didn't know that at the time. That's your testimony, but we now know that,
I understood it
right?
meant to mean Burisma.
Mr. Holmes says you said Biden's right after that, but I know you don't recall that, right?
That's correct.
Do you dispute it?
I do.
Okay, but you don't recall it. But we know that that's what the president meant, right? And you do confirm that he wanted to talk about investigations with you.
Well, now with the complete picture, what he said 24 hours before, yes,
I understand.
it makes sense.
And you said it's wrong to investigate political opponents. We've agreed on that today, haven't we, sir?
Yes.
And yet, of course, that's what we know the president was asking for. Let me ask you something. Who would have benefited from an investigation of the president's political opponents?
I don't want to characterize who would have and who would not have.
I know you don't want to, sir. That's my question. Would you answer it for me?
Restate your question.
Who would benefit from an investigation of the president's political opponent?
Well, presumably the person who asked for the investigation.
Who's that?
If the president asked for the investigation, it would be he.
Well, it's not a hypothetical, is it, sir? We just went around this track, didn't we? The president asked you about investigations. He was talking about the Bidens. When he asked you about the Biden investigation, who was he seeking to benefit?
He did not ask me about the Biden investigation.
When he
I've
asked you
said that
about investigations,
19 times, Mr. Malone.
Sir, we just went through this. When he asked you about investigations, which we all agree now means the Bidens, we just did this about 30 seconds ago. Right? It's a pretty simple question, isn't it? I guess I'm having trouble why you can't just say.
When he asked about investigations, I assumed he meant.
I know what you assume.
Company.
But who would benefit from an investigation of the Bidens?
They're two different questions.
I'm just asking you one. Who would benefit from an investigation of the Bidens?
I assume President Trump would benefit.
There we have it. See? Didn't hurt a bit, did it? Didn't hurt a bit. But let me ask you something.
Mr. Maloney?
Hold on, sir.
Excuse me. I've been very forthright, and I really resent what you're trying to do.
Fair enough. You've been very forthright. This is your third try to do so, sir. Didn't work so well the first time, did it? We had a little declaration come in after. Remember that? And now we're here a third time, and we got a doozy of a statement from you this morning. There's a whole bunch of stuff you don't recall. So all due respect, sir, we appreciate your candor, but let's be really clear on what it took to get it out of you. So my question is, when the president's putting pressure on the Ukrainians with holding a meeting to get this investigation that you and I agree would benefit him politically, what kind of position does that put the Ukrainians in, sir?
A terrible position.
Terrible position. Why?
Why does it put them in a terrible position?
Why?
Well, obviously, they're not receiving ultimately what they thought was coming to them, and they're put in a position that jeopardizes their security.
A position that jeopardizes their security, and they're being asked to do an investigation to help their security, essentially, that would benefit the president politically. In other words, you might say they're being asked to give him a personal benefit in exchange for an official act. Is that a fair summary?
In your hypothetical, that's correct.
It's not a hypothetical, sir. This is real life. Were they asked to give him a personal benefit in exchange for an official act?
Sir, I am not going to go around in circles with you. Please be clear about what you're asking me.
My time's expired, sir. Thank you for your appearance.
Ms. Demings.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
Do you have any knowledge of a possible meeting on or around May 7th involving then President-elect Zelensky and several of his aides to discuss how to handle pressure from President Trump and Mr. Giuliani about investigating the Bidens?
I don't recall such a meeting.
You don't recall such a meeting? You don't recall hearing anything about such a meeting?
Again,
if you don't have firsthand knowledge?
If I don't have record schedules, right now I don't recall anything about such a meeting.
Ambassador, in the May...
Is this a meeting among the Ukrainians?
It's a meeting among the Ukrainians involving then President-elect Zelensky, so this would have been early on in his presidency with several aides to discuss how to handle pressure from President Trump and Mr. Giuliani about investigating the Bidens.
Yeah, I don't recall such a meeting.
You don't remember that. Ambassador, in the May, I believe it was the May 23rd meeting, you talked about how the president categorized Ukraine, what he thought about Ukraine. I believe that meeting was on May 23rd. Did you ever hear President Zelensky relay any concerns about you, about how he felt, about how the United States viewed him, whether he was being taken seriously, or any concerns about being used as a tool for political reasons?
Well, I saw that in an email from Ambassador Taylor. We obviously tried to relay to President Zelensky the glass half full version of how the United States felt about Ukraine, not the glass half empty version, which is we're here for you, we support you, and we're trying very hard to get you the meeting with President Trump.
So after hearing that from Ambassador Taylor, you tried to reassure President Zelensky that America was truly on their side. Is that what
I think
you
we've
just
been
said?
trying to assure President Zelensky throughout his entire term as a president.
Ambassador, I know you said you don't quite remember exactly when you came to the realization that Burisma actually meant Biden's. But back on May 6th, when asked about a news report about the role of former Vice President's son on Burisma, President Trump told Fox News that it was, and I quote, a major scandal, major problem. On May 9th, the New York Times reported that Rudy Giuliani planned to travel to Ukraine and, quote, shortly to meet with President Zelensky to urge him to pursue the 2016 election and the involvement of Hunter Biden in Burisma, unquote. Are you saying that you did not realize at that time, we're talking about on May 9th of this year, that Mr. Giuliani wanted to urge President Zelensky to pursue the 2016 election and the involvement of Hunter Biden of Burisma?
I do now, but I did not then.
You did not know that, and I believe you said earlier that you did not pay any attention or much attention at all to any of the numerous news reports of the person you were directed by the president to work with when he was on television over and over and over again talking about Hunter Biden and Burisma.
No, I did not.
On September 9th, in a text from Ambassador Taylor, he said something to the effect, are we now saying that aid is tied to investigations? And I believe you text back, call me. Then you had a conversation with President Trump. And President Trump said something to the effect that there is no quid pro quo. Do you know what prompted him to say that? You asked him, what do you want? And he goes directly to, there is no quid pro quo, as opposed to going directly to the list of things that he wanted. What prompted him to use that term?
I have no clue.
Did you discuss your conversation or your text from Ambassador Taylor with President Trump before he made that statement?
I did not. I asked a very open-ended question. What do you want from me?
And you remember that directly, although there are several other conversations that you cannot recall because you don't have your notes or your documents or your emails or other information. But you remember that call specifically, exactly what the president said to you in response to your question about what do you want. Why is that?
I remember the first girl I kissed. I mean, I remember certain things.
Well, I won't say that, but anyway.
I remembered that conversation because, as I said, it was a pretty intense, short conversation.
And tell me again about the conversation you had at the restaurant that was overheard by Mr. Holmes, because that was a conversation with the president. Tell me about that conversation with the president. What was said on the phone?
Again, I don't remember the specifics. I'm being guided by what Mr. Holmes testified to. I said I didn't dispute the basic, subject of the conversation. As I said, we were talking primarily about ASAP Rocky. That was a completely unrelated matter, and I think the president may have brought up, how did it go with Zelensky, or is he going to do the investigations, which we've been talking about for weeks. And then, as I said, I dispute the Mr. Holmes' characterization of what I said afterwards.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. I'm just going to pick up on that September 9th conversation, which the president allegedly said, I want nothing, I don't want a quid pro quo. I presume that on this September 9th conversation, the president did not mention that that was the same day that we launched a congressional investigation into whether there was a quid pro quo. Did he say that to you?
Again, I know all of that today, but he did not. We didn't have a time to talk about things like that.
And I presume he also didn't mention the whistleblower complaint that also alleged that there was a quid pro quo that day.
He did not.
Okay. So you can't rule out the possibility that the reason why he started talking that way on that day is because of the congressional investigation.
I can't rule that out.
The inauguration of President Zelensky was on May 20th, correct?
Correct.
As you stated, you attended this inauguration with Senator Johnson, Secretary Perry, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, and others, right?
Correct.
But Vice President Pence was supposed to originally attend that, correct?
I believe so.
We learned from Jennifer Williams, a witness who testified, that it was at the president's direction on May 13th that the vice president not attend. She said, quote, that according to the vice president's chief of staff, the president determined that the vice president would not go. Do you know why the vice president did not attend the inauguration?
No clue.
I want to point to a New York Times article from last week that says that Lev Parnas' attorney, you've heard of this gentleman, Lev Parnas, an associate of Rudy Giuliani. Who's
only what I've read very recently.
He's recently indicted.
Yeah.
Mr. Parnas told a representative of the incoming government, the Zelensky government, that it had to announce an investigation into Trump's political rival, Joseph R. Biden, and his son, or else Vice President Mike Pence would not attend the swearing-in of the new president, and the United States would freeze aid. Did the Vice President not attend possibly because this investigation had not yet been initiated by the Zelensky government?
I have no idea.
You can't rule it out, right?
Again, I have no idea.
You have no basis for ruling it out, however, correct?
All I know is that the leader of the delegation was Secretary Perry, who invited me along.
Interestingly, Ambassador Sondland, since you came forward in these proceedings, others in the administration have tried to distance themselves from you. On October 14th, Rudy Giuliani told the Washington Post that Sondland, quote, seemed to be in charge, close quote, of the effort to get Ukrainian officials to publish or to publicly announce investigations. Of course, that's false, correct?
If I had been in charge, I would have asked President Trump to have the meeting without preconditions, and the meeting would have occurred a long time ago.
That's exactly right. The president is the one that wanted these investigations, as we learned later on in reading the July 25th call transcript. Isn't that right?
The president, through Mr. Giuliani, is conveyed through Mr. Giuliani, wanted the investigations.
Mr. Tim Morrison came in yesterday, and in his deposition testimony, as well as yesterday, disparaged you too. He called you, quote unquote, the Gordon problem.
That's what my wife calls me. Maybe they're talking.
He,
Should I be worried?
Maybe. On October 8th of this year, the president tweeted that you are a really good man and a great American. And of course, on November 8th, 1 month later, he He said, "Let me just tell you, I hardly know the gentleman."
Easy come, easy go.
You know, what I'm concerned about, you were part of the three amigos, but what I'm really concerned about, Ambassador Sondland, is that the president and the good folks over here, my Republican colleagues, are now casting you as the one amigo, the one lonely amigo they're going to throw under the bus. But the truth is that, as you said in your opening statement, the suggestion that you were engaged in some rogue diplomacy or irregular channel of diplomacy is, quote unquote, absolutely false. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
The presumption that military aid was conditioned on investigations was based on Mulvaney's statement that we saw on the video. Isn't that right?
Well, I didn't have the benefit at that time of Mulvaney's statement.
But you would stand by the presumption that you had based on what you know now, right?
Correct.
And on September 1, when you told Andrei Yermak your presumption, which you've told us about military aid being conditioned on the investigations, you then told Mr. Morrison what you told Yermak, and Morrison did not try to dispute your presumption, correct?
I don't recall him disputing it. I think I went right over to him and just repeated the conversation.
And when you told Vice President Pence your concerns, he did not dispute that as well?
He didn't respond. He just listened.
And when you told Secretary Pompeo, that wasn't disputed as well?
I don't recall.
Thank you.
That concludes the member questioning. Mr. Nunes, do you have any closing remarks?
Just briefly, Ambassador, I know you want to get on a plane, so I want to thank you for your indulgence today. Once again, the American people have seen another failure of their preposterous conspiracy theory, which that's if their conspiracy theory doesn't change between now and our next hearing, which is in a few hours from now or another hour or so. And it keeps changing every day. The claim, Ambassador, that you had you were accused of having an irregular channel, drug deals, now supposedly you're one amigo. Nobody on this side of the aisle claimed that you were one amigo.
I lost my amigos?
Yeah, not from us, not from us. No bribes given to, that you made any bribes to the Ukrainian people or to the Ukrainian president. Your co-conspirator, Kurt Volker. I find it remarkable and troubling how the Democrats and their collaborators in the press have been able to vilify Ambassador Volker, who was supposed to work on these matters in Ukraine, like you, Ambassador. It was a very regular channel, and no amount of storytelling by the left and the Democrats on this dais will change that. It was the regular channel. Testimony received today was far from compelling, conclusive, and provides zero evidence of any of the crimes that have been alleged. In fact, Ambassador Sondland testified that he presumed the temporary pause in military aid was conditioned on Ukraine carrying out the investigations the Democrats are desperate to portray as nefarious. The Democrats have, as their custom, seized on this presumption as proof they can use it against the president. However, Ambassador Sondland testified in his deposition that when he asked President Trump, "What do you want from Ukraine?" President Trump replied, "I want nothing. There is no quid pro quo." Let me repeat. President Trump said, "I want nothing. There is no quid pro quo." This comes on the heels of the testimony by Ambassador Volker that he saw no evidence of bribery, extortion, quid pro quo, or treasonous actions. We didn't get to ask him about obstruction of justice because we didn't know that was on the table until today. Like the president's call with President Zelensky, Democrats want the American people to believe, as one Democrat on this committee put it, that hearsay is much better than direct evidence. And I think Mr. Ratcliffe from Texas laid out the direct evidence that we have from your testimony today. Nothing we have heard establishes a claim that the president acted improperly in his dealings with Ukraine, and certainly nothing has been presented to support anything near impeachment. In the meantime, Mr. Chair, we continue to have no answers to the questions that only you know. Starting with, who is the whistleblower who gave birth to this hoax, and what was the nature of his coordination with the Democrats on this committee? Second, what is the full extent of Ukraine's election meddling against the Trump campaign in 2016? And finally, why did Burisma hire Hunter Biden? What did he do for them? And did his position impact any U.S. government actions under the Obama administration? Another hearing in the books and no answers to basic three material, factual questions that we need answers to. Yield back, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here.
Thank you.
I thank the ranking member for his remarks. Ambassador Sondland, thank you for your testimony today. This is a seminal moment in our investigation, and the evidence you have brought forward is deeply significant and troubling. It's been a long hearing, and I know Americans watching throughout the country may not have had the opportunity to watch all of it. So I'm going to go through a few of the highlights, and I'm not going to try to paraphrase what you've said. I'm going to refer to your opening statement. We all understood that if we refused to work with Mr. Giuliani, we would lose an important opportunity to cement relations between the United States and Ukraine. So we followed the president's orders. Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing investigations of the 2016 election, DNC server, and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew that these investigations were important to the President. Later, you testified, I tried diligently to ask why the aid was suspended, but I never received a clear answer. In the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations of the 2016 election and Burisma, as Mr. Giuliani had demanded. I shared concerns of the potential quid pro quo regarding the security aid with Senator Ron Johnson, and I also shared my concern with the Ukrainians. So much for the Ukrainians didn't know. You can't have a quid pro quo unless the Ukrainians know, and you have testified today, Ambassador, the Ukrainians knew. You further testified Mr. Giuliani emphasized that the president wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing Ukraine to look into corruption issues. Mr. Giuliani specifically mentioned the 2016 election, including the DNC server and Burisma, as two topics of importance to the president. In reference to the July 10th meeting at the White House, which you attended with Ambassador Bolton and others and the Ukrainian delegation, you said, I recall mentioning the prerequisite of investigations before any White House call or meeting. You further testified, again, Mr. Giuliani's demand that President Zelensky make a public statement about investigations. I knew that the topic of investigations was important to President Trump. You testified later, I know that members of this committee have frequently framed these complicated issues in the form of a simple question. Was there a quid pro quo? As I testified previously with regard to the requested White House call and White House meeting, the answer is yes. We all understood these prerequisites for the White House call and White House meeting reflected President Trump's desires and requirements. Later, on the subject of security aid, you testified, in the absence of any credible explanation for the hold, I came to the conclusion that the aid, like the White House visit, was jeopardized In preparation for the September 1 meeting in Warsaw, I asked Secretary Pompeo whether a face-to-face conversation between Trump with Zelensky could help break the logjam. And this is from an email that the State Department refuses to provide to us, but you have provided to us, Ambassador. It reads, should we block time in Warsaw for a short pull-aside for POTUS to meet Zelensky? I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye, that is the president, and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place in mid-September, that Z should be able to move forward publicly with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS and to the United States. Hopefully that will break the logjam. And Secretary Pompeo's reply, yes. Not what issues of importance to the POTUS, not what are you talking about, Ambassador Sondland, because Secretary Pompeo was on the July 25th phone call. He knew what issues were important to POTUS, and there were two of them, the investigation into 2016 and the DNC server, and the investigation into the Bidens. By the end of August, you testified, my belief was that if Ukraine did something to demonstrate a serious intention to fight corruption, specifically addressing Burisma and the 2016 server, then the hold on military aid would be lifted. I mentioned to Vice President Pence before the meetings with Ukrainians that I had concerns that the delay in aid had become tied to the issue of investigations. And as you testified, he gave you no response. No, what are you talking about, Ambassador? How could that be, Ambassador? How do we clear this up, Ambassador? He merely nodded his head or took it in. And of course, the record of that 25th call between President Trump and Zelensky was in the Vice President's reading book earlier. Then you testified, my goal at the time was to do what was necessary to get the aid released, to break the logjam. I believe that the public statement we have been discussing for weeks was essential to advancing that goal. Now, my colleagues seem to believe, and let me add too about this call you had with the President, you have confirmed today, in addition to claiming there was no quid pro quo, the President was adamant that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public. That's what you have confirmed. That is what you also told Ambassador Taylor. So he would deny there was a quid pro quo, but he was adamant that Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public. Now, I've said a lot of things about President Trump over the years. I have very strong feelings about President Trump, which are neither here nor there. But I will say this on the President's behalf. I do not believe that the President would allow himself to be led by the nose by Rudy Giuliani or Ambassador Sondland or anybody else. I think the President was the one who decided whether a meeting would happen, whether aid would be lifted, not anyone who worked for him. And so the answer to the question, who was refusing the meeting with Zelensky that you believe should take place and Ambassador Volker believes should take place and everybody believes should take place? The only question was when. Who was the one standing in the way of that meeting? Who was the one refusing to take that meeting? There's only one answer to that question, and it's Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States. So who was holding up the military assistance? Was it you, Ambassador Sondland? No, it wasn't. Was it Ambassador Volker? No. Was it Ambassador Taylor? No. Was it Deputy Secretary Kent? No. Was it Secretary of State Pompeo? No. Who had the decision to release the aid? It was one person, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. Now, my colleagues seem to think unless the President says the magic words, I hereby bribe the Ukrainians, that there's no evidence of bribery or other high crimes or misdemeanors. But let's look to the best evidence of what's in the President's head. What's his intent? What's the reason behind the hold on the meeting and on the aid? Let's look at what the President has to say. Let's look at what's undisputed about what the President has to say. And you know how we know what the President has to say? not because what you have represented or others have represented, but because we have a record of his conversation. And with who? The one who really matters. With the other president, Zelensky. And this is what he says. He says, Rudy very much knows what's happening. And he is a very capable guy. This is after he says he wants a favor. And he goes into CrowdStrike in 2016. He says, Rudy very much knows what's happening and is a very capable guy. If you could speak to him, that would be great. The former ambassador from the United States, the woman was bad news. And the people she was dealing with in Ukraine were bad news. So I just want to let you know that. The other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General, that would be great. Biden went about bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you could look into it, it sounds horrible to me. So what's in the president's mind when he has placed this otherwise inexplicable hold on the aid, when he refuses to take the meeting? What's on his mind? Biden. He makes that abundantly clear. I understand, Ambassador, you said you didn't make the connection between Burisma and Biden. I will let the American people judge the credibility of that answer. But there's no mistaking what Donald Trump's interest was. There's no mistaking about what Donald Trump meant when he had that call with you on an unsecure phone as you're sitting there, an outdoor terrace in Ukraine. When the president said investigation, he meant Biden. He made that abundantly clear to the president of Ukraine the day before. The question is not what the president meant. The question is not whether he was responsible for holding up the aid. He was. The question is not whether everybody knew it. Apparently they did. The question is, what are we prepared to do about it? Is there any accountability? Or are we forced to conclude that this is just now the world that we live in, when a president of the United States can withhold vital military aid from an ally at war with the Russians, an ally fighting our fight too, to defend our country against Russian aggression? Are we prepared to say, in the words of Mick Mulvaney, get over it or get used to it? We are not prepared to say that. We're not prepared to say that. And I appreciate Ambassador Ambassador Sondland, I appreciate the fact that you have not opined on whether the president should be impeached or not be impeached, or whether the crime of bribery or the impeachable offense of bribery or other high crimes and misdemeanors has been committed. That is for us to decide in consultation with our constituents and our conscience. That is for us to decide. And much as my colleagues have said otherwise, this is not an easy decision for any of us. And much as my colleagues may say otherwise, this is not something we relish. For over a year, I resisted this whole idea of going down the road to impeachment. But it was made necessary, and not by the whistleblower, but by the actions of the president. I'm continually struck how my colleagues would suggest that because the president got caught, we should ignore the fact that he was conditioning official acts in order to get political favors, in order to get an investigation against his rival. Getting caught is no defense, not to a violation of the Constitution or to a violation of his oath of office, and it certainly doesn't give us a reason to ignore our own oath of office. We are adjourned.
Compassion, Chairman Adam Schiff right there, gaveling down the hearing after close to 7 hours. Bringing it back to what Democrats consider their key piece of evidence, that July 25th phone call between the president and President Zelensky of Ukraine, described at first by a whistleblower in August, released by the president himself on September 25th. The key witness today said he did not know about the call at the time, Gordon Sondland, but Chairman Schiff still called his testimony today a seminal moment, significant, and you heard the chairman there summarize the big points. of Ambassador Sondland's testimony today that he was following the president's orders, that he was working through the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, at the direction of the president, that he believed clearly that a White House meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump was a quid pro quo, that it wasn't going to happen unless the investigations the president were calling for were announced by the Ukrainians. On the issue of military aid, whether that was withheld, you heard Chairman Schiff there say that Ambassador Sondland did tell the Ukrainian president later in the year, in September, that the aid was being held up until the investigations went through. But there was a lot of dispute between Democrats and Republicans over whether exactly Ambassador Sondland was saying there was a quid pro quo between the military aid being frozen and Ukrainians pursuing the investigations. Mary Bruce, our senior congressional correspondent, you did see Republicans begin to hit their stride in the second half of this hearing when they continued to question Ambassador Sondland, saying, did the president ever tell you that this aid should be conditioned on investigations?
Yeah, and George, Republican lawmakers here actually are speaking right behind me, hammering home this point again. They have been arguing over and over again that Gordon Sondland was reflecting what was just his presumption, and that a presumption does not equate evidence. They have argued over and over again that the president was not, that Gordon Sondland was essentially reflecting his own opinion when he went to Ukrainian officials and said that military aid was conditioned, that military aid would not flow until they announced these investigations. Democrats, of course, arguing the exact opposite. They say that it is clear that there was a quid pro quo, that everybody knew about it, and that this amounts to seminal evidence that is further proof that the president may have committed bribery.
And John Carl, thank you, Mary. John Carl at the White House. We saw the president over the course of this hearing coming out and describing that September 9th phone call, which is also at issue, his phone call with Ambassador Sondland, where the president continued to repeat that there was no quid pro quo. That's exactly what he told Ambassador Sondland.